Are guilt, failure, or fear keeping you stuck in the past? Feel like you can't move on? Today's story checks out the psychological truth that your darkest failure, guilt, or fear can actually be your biggest push toward success. This channel is a place for exploring the timeless wisdom from great philosophers and thinkers, right alongside the wisdom from the Psalms. We use modern stories to break down how you can use this knowledge in your life so you can move on and evolve. If you're into this idea, like and subscribe for more. Eliza's journey starts now. The hum is the first thing you notice, a low, oppressive, fluorescent buzz that blankets the cavernous space, punctuated by the high-pitched scream of packing tape and the rumble of diesel engines. This is Eliza's world, a map of cold steel corridors defined by the smell of cardboard, dust, and hydraulic fluid. She works in the warehouse, a labyrinth of logistics where she is just another item in the inventory. The job is not good or bad. It is simply the shelf where she has been placed. Her scanner is cold in her hand, a metronome for her thoughts. Each beep is an echo. Each package sealed is a reminder of her own life, closed up and filed away. Her mind operates just like this warehouse. It is a psychological inventory system that, instead of scanning barcodes, obsessively recatalogues a single item, the SKU of failure. It has a serial number. The date, 5 years ago, when Eliza's dreams, the small decor shop she opened with her companion Mark, imploded. The bankruptcy was a fire that consumed her savings and incinerated her self-worth. Now that failure, that loop of resentment, is her permanent shift manager. It dictates her movements, ensuring she never deviates from the safe, numbing task of stacking boxes. This isn't just a memory. It's a full-time job she performs inside the other, this constant retallying of every mistake. We recognize this state. There is an ancient emotional language for this precise condition, a warning found in the 37th Psalm. It is a plea to the soul: do not fret. Do not allow your mind to be consumed by the past, by the memory of failure, by the injustice of what was lost. To fret is to ruminate, to chew on the poison of yesterday. Eliza is fretting. She is so focused on the ghost of that failure that she cannot inherit the land. She cannot possess the only thing she actually has, the present moment. Her obsession with the past ensures she has no future. It is a self-imposed exile from her own life. This is the mechanism of ressentiment that the philosophers warned us about. It is not just anger or sadness. It is a complex, bitter poison. It is the weakness of the trapped soul, dressing itself up as a form of justice. Her mind tells her she has a right to be miserable because of what happened. It blames the fire, the bad luck, the economy, for her current inaction. This resentment feels like a shield, but it is a cage. It allows her to remain passive, to stay on the shelf, because it provides a perfect, unshakable explanation for why she must never, ever try again. The pain has become her identity. The shift finally ends. The fluorescent hum is replaced by the tired drone of her car's engine. She drives home, exhausted not from the physical labor, but from the crushing, invisible weight of her own mental inventory. She craves refuge, a place where the scanning stops, where the shift manager of her past finally clocks out. But her home is not a sanctuary. It is the other half of the prison. The air inside is stale with unspoken words and the ghost of that same failure. Mark is there. He is the living embodiment of the realism that grew from the ashes of their shared dream. He is the anchor. She walks in, and the silence is immediate. He is on the sofa, scrolling, the blue light of his phone illuminating a face that offers no escape. She sighs a small comment about the long day. He barely looks up. He offers no comfort. Instead, he offers the anchor. He says at least the paycheck is stable, right? He reminds her that it is so much better than their last adventure. The word adventure is a weapon coated in sarcasm. It is the word he now uses for her dream. His comment is not supportive. It is a boundary. It is the wall of the cell, reminding her not to climb. And with that, the wall of silence descends. It is a familiar quiet, thick and heavy. She is home, but she is utterly alone. This is the suffocation. This is the trap. She is held captive by the warehouse, by the logistics of a life she hates, and she comes home only to be held captive by a relationship that offers no escape, only a different set of bars. How can a person even begin to dream of liberation when their own past is their warden and their partner is their cellmate? The question hangs in the air unanswered as she begins the empty routine of the evening, a prisoner on parole until the next shift begins. We see this clearly. The realism that Mark offers is a form of sabotage, perhaps unintentional but devastatingly effective. It is the external validation for the internal voice of resentment. He confirms her deepest fear, that she is broken, that the failure was the final word, and that safety is the only good left in the world. Her spirit is caught between these two forces, the internal loop of her past trauma and the external anchor of her present relationship. Both are telling her the exact same thing. Do not move. Stay on the shelf. It is safer here. The tragedy is that she is beginning to believe them. The silence in their home is a different kind from the silence of the warehouse. The warehouse is the absence of life. The home is the presence of tension. It is a quiet held in place by years of unspoken disappointments. Eliza moves through the living room, her body still aching from the shift, and her eyes land on it. A small side table, one leg split, wobbling under the weight of a lamp. It's been broken for weeks. Mark ignores it, a monument to their shared inertia. But tonight, Eliza sees it differently. A flicker of something other than resentment stirs in her. Not a fully formed idea, but an impulse, a faint echo of the person she used to be. She finds an old sketchbook and a pencil, relics from her previous life buried in a drawer. She sits on the floor, the rough paper under her hand, feeling both foreign and familiar. She begins to sketch, her fingers remembering a forgotten language. She draws the table, not as it is, but as it could be. She designs a new leg, a reinforcement, maybe a clever shelf underneath. The familiar scent of graphite and paper rises, and for a few minutes, the warehouse and the failure and the heavy, oppressive silence of her life recede. The buzzing in her head stops. There is only the line, the problem, and the solution. Mark's shadow falls over the page before she hears him. He is standing over her, looking down at the drawing. He isn't angry. He isn't aggressive. He is worse. He is the voice of reason. He is the auditor of her impulses. He sighs, that familiar, weary sound that precedes every execution. He asks her if she is really starting this again. He gestures vaguely at the sketch, at the broken table, at the whole of their stagnant lives. He says they both know how this particular story ends. He reminds her, in that calm, rational tone that kills all hope, of the shop. He tells her that if it is not going to be perfect, if she cannot guarantee the outcome, it is not even worth the effort. The words land, and the paralysis is immediate. It is a physical sensation, a cold flood of concrete setting in her veins. The pencil stops. The creative impulse, that tiny, fragile spark of life, is extinguished. The buzzing in her head returns, louder this time, filled with the static of his realism. She closes the sketchbook. The table remains broken. The inaction wins. This is the second layer of her prison. The resentment for the past is the wall behind her, but this paralysis is the wall in front, preventing any forward movement. It is the absolute terror of making another mistake, of confirming her status as a failure. We often mistake this paralysis for a pursuit of excellence. We call it high standards. But this is a lie. This perfectionism is not the love of the beautiful. It is the terror of the flawed. It is the fear of judgment, the fear of ridicule, the fear of the "I told you so," all disguised in the noble costume of quality control. It is a sophisticated, internal sabotage system that whispers a devastatingly logical argument. A flawless nothing is always safer than an imperfect something. It is the ultimate defense mechanism for a person who has been deeply wounded by a past failure. It promises to protect them from ever feeling that pain again. And Mark's realism is the fuel for this engine of paralysis. His voice is the external validation for her internal critic. He confirms her deepest, darkest suspicion, that she is not capable, that her ideas lead to ruin, and that her only value is in her obedience to the safe grey routine. His fear reinforces her own, This is how the trap becomes inescapable. She is trapped by her memory of the fire, and he is standing guard with a fire extinguisher, ready to douse any spark that might just possibly lead to another. The brokenness, he implies, is safer than the attempt to build. There is an ancient wisdom, a profound truth, that was written as an antidote to this very feeling of being flawed and broken. It is a description of the self, found in the poetic lines of the 139th Psalm. It describes a different kind of value. It describes a soul that was woven together in a hidden place, made in a wonderful and deliberate way. This wisdom does not celebrate perfection. It celebrates intention. It suggests that our value is not in our flawless execution, our perfect track record, but in our very existence, in our unique and authentic design. This is the truth Eliza has been trained to forget. She believes her worth is tied to her results, and her last result was a catastrophe. This is the psychological mechanism at work. The failure of the shop, that massive burning trauma, was not just a financial loss. It was the birth of a shadow, and her paralysis is that shadow. It is the dark, cold echo of her past, a terrifying spectre that rises up whenever she dares to create. Its one and only job is to ensure that she will never again be vulnerable enough to be judged. It accomplishes this mission by making sure she is never brave enough to try. This is how self-preservation, when twisted by trauma, becomes a life sentence. The protection mechanism has mutated into a prison, and her companion holds the key, locking the door from the outside. The phone call comes on Sunday, as it always does. It is a ritual, a checkpoint. Eliza sits at her small kitchen table, the silence of the apartment heavy around her. Mark is out, running errands, which provides a small, temporary relief, but the call itself brings its own kind of pressure. She sees her mother's name on the screen and braces herself, adopting the mask of the dutiful, stable daughter. The conversation begins with the usual pleasantries, a script they have both memorized. But inevitably it pivots. Her mother, in her gentle, worrying tone, brings up the job. She says she is just so grateful, so relieved, that Eliza found this stable position at the warehouse. Then comes the inevitable reference, the polite coded term for Eliza's greatest shame. Her mother calls it the incident, or sometimes that business with the shop. She says they were all just so worried, so terrified after the incident. She explains, as she has many times before, that art thing, as she calls Eliza's passion, was always just too risky. It was a nice hobby, but not a life. Her voice is filled with genuine, loving concern. She is not being cruel, she is being protective. She concludes with the family motto, the foundational belief of their entire lineage. It is always, always better to be safe than sorry. Eliza just listens. She makes the appropriate agreeing sounds. Yes, Mom, I know, it is safe. You're right. She confirms the narrative. She validates their relief. She plays the part of the daughter who has finally seen the error of her ways and settled into a sensible, predictable, and joyless life. Each yes is a small betrayal. Each word of agreement feels like swallowing ash. The call ends, and Eliza stares at the wall, the silence rushing back in. But now it is filled with a different kind of void. It is the hollowness of a life being lived according to someone else's blueprint. This is the third wall of her prison. We must understand what is happening here. This is not malice. This is not a mother intentionally trying to crush her daughter's spirit. This is, in many ways, a tragic form of love. It is the transmission of fear, passed down from one generation to the next, disguised as wisdom. Her parents, who likely lived through their own scarcities and disappointments, genuinely believe that safety is the highest possible good. Their definition of success is the absence of failure. Their definition of security is the avoidance of risk. They love Eliza, but their love is conditioned upon her stability, and their definition of stability has become her existential prison. This is the script they have handed her, the role she is now forced to play. The great mythologists like Joseph Campbell had a name for this exact dynamic. This is the refusal of the call. Eliza's passion for building, for creating, for art, that is her soul's true calling. It is the adventure she is meant to take. But she refuses to even hear it because the guardians of her old world, her family, have told her the world outside is too dangerous. They are the gatekeepers, lovingly chaining her to the ordinary world of the warehouse, convincing her that the treasure she seeks is an illusion, and the dragons are all too real. She is trapped in the first act of her own life story, living their script instead of writing her own. This is one of the most painful dilemmas of the human experience. What happens when the path to your own soul requires you to disappoint the very people you love most? What happens when authenticity looks like betrayal? There is a powerful ancient song of the soul, a cry for this specific kind of courage found in the 27th Psalm. The line is a declaration of radical self-trust. It says that even if my father and my mother forsake me, I will be received. This is not a literal instruction to abandon family. It is a profound psychological metaphor. It is the recognition that at some point, your loyalty to your own internal truth, your own path, must become your highest priority. Eliza has not yet found that courage. She is choosing obedience over authenticity. And the cost is enormous. She is living a life that is not her own. This is the definition of a mortgaged identity. She has traded her potential for her family's approval. She has traded her spark for their comfort. And now she is trapped. She is trapped by Mark's fear, which validates her paralysis, and she is trapped by her family's fear, which validates her resentment. The voices in her head, the ones that tell her she is a failure and that she should just be grateful for the safety of the warehouse, are not even her own. They are the internalized echoes. She looks at the phone, now dark on the table. The question hangs in the sterile air of her kitchen. Is she being a grateful daughter, or is she just being an obedient one? She is paying for their peace of mind with the currency of her own. She is buying their approval by sacrificing her soul. And the question that must be asked, the one she is too terrified to even form in her mind, is this: what is the final price of that obedience? How long can you live someone else's life before you forget you ever had one of your own? The job, the relationship, the family expectations. They have all converged into a single, unmovable mass of reality. She is no longer a person. She is a function. It is the middle of the month, and the ritual has begun. The laptop is open on the kitchen table, its screen casting a pale, clinical light on their faces. This is the altar of their practicality, paying the bills. The click of the mouse is the only sound, a sharp counterpoint to the heavy shared silence. This is the moment where their life is reduced to a ledger, a column of debits that just barely matches the credits. There is no joy in this, only the dull, repetitive relief of survival. The numbers on the screen are a constant reminder of the precise altitude of their lives, just above sea level, with no hope of climbing. The tension is a physical thing, a thickness in the air. It is the pressure of the unlived, the unsaid, the undreamed. Eliza watches the cursor hover over their dwindling checking account balance. The feeling of being trapped is so potent, it feels like a hand on her chest. She feels the walls of the warehouse, the echoes of her family's expectations, and the weight of Mark's pragmatism all converging in this single, sterile moment. She has to say something, anything, to puncture the vacuum. A tiny idea, small and safe, has been forming. It is not a dream. It is not a shop. It is just something. She clears her throat. She mentions that old broken furniture in the storage unit, the one she has been meaning to fix. She says maybe she could fix it up and just sell it online. Just that one piece, not a business, not an adventure, just a way to make a little extra, to create a small pocket of air in their suffocating budget. The words sound small and timid even to her own ears. She is asking for permission, not to dream, but to merely act in the smallest possible way. She waits, her breath held, her eyes fixed on the numbers on the screen, not daring to look at his face. Mark does not look up. His eyes remain locked on the ledger, his focus absolute. For a moment she thinks he has not heard her, but then he speaks, his voice flat, devoid of anger, full of that terrible, unshakable realism that has become his entire personality. He tells her, Eliza, that they are not those kind of people. He says they are not lucky. They do not have good timing. He tells her that those things, those ideas, are for other people. He says they should just focus on what they are good at. His mouse clicks paying the electric bill. He says what they are good at is paying their bills on time and not dreaming. The words are not a shout. They are a quiet, final judgment, and they land with devastating precision. The tiny, fragile impulse in her chest, the small spark of maybe, dissolves into ash. A cold wave of shame washes over her. He is right. Who is she to have ideas? Who is she to think she could create value from junk? The voice of her own inadequacy, the internal critic that has managed her for 5 years, speaks up, its tone identical to Mark's. It tells her she is a warehouse worker. She is a failure. She is the woman who burned her life down. She should just be grateful for the stable job. She should be grateful for this, for the ability to just pay the bills. This is the mechanism. This is how the anchor holds. We see how the fear is transmitted, how it becomes a shared virus. His realism is not realism at all. It is his own profound lack of self-worth, his own deep-seated fear projected onto her. When he says we are not those kind of people, he is making a confession. He is announcing his own resignation from life. He is admitting that he believes he is not one of the lucky ones, that he does not deserve more than this. And for his worldview to remain stable, he needs her to believe it too. He needs her to be his partner in smallness. There is a profound ancient wisdom that stands in direct opposition to this feeling of insignificance. A poem, a song, written in the 8th Psalm, that captures the central paradox of our existence. The author looks at the vastness of the cosmos, the moon and the stars, and is overwhelmed by a sense of scale. The author asks, what is this human, this small creature, that you are even mindful of him? But the conclusion is not, as Eliza feels, that we are nothing. The stunning conclusion is that we were crowned with glory and with honor, placed just a little lower than the angels, given dominion. This is the blueprint of the human soul. But Eliza cannot feel this. She does not feel crowned. She feels discarded. She feels like an inventory item, a SKU number in a system, valuable only for her function. Her companion's words have just confirmed her deepest, darkest suspicion. She does not deserve more. The philosophers like Kierkegaard spoke of this. They identified a specific, quiet, and pervasive form of despair. It is not the loud, dramatic agony of a great tragedy. It is the chronic, dull, internal suffering of not being your authentic self. It is the sickness of the unlived life. And what we are witnessing at this kitchen table is a conspiracy of despair. Their relationship is no longer a partnership. It is an unspoken agreement, a pact to protect one another from the terrifying anxiety of true, authentic change. He sees the spark in her, and his own fear compels him to extinguish it, because her light would force him to see his own darkness. Her ambition would challenge his inertia, so he must keep her small to justify his own smallness. Their routine, this monthly ritual of paying the bills, is not an act of peace. It is not a sign of stability. It is an armistice. It is a truce signed in the mutual fear of ambition, and this prison they have built together is what they have tragically mistaken for a home. The day had a jagged edge. At the warehouse, the rhythm of the line was broken. A moment of distraction, her mind lost in the familiar spiraling loop of the past, and a simple task went wrong. A misread scanner, a misplaced pallet. It was a minor error in the grand scheme of the building, but the supervisor's reaction was one of quiet, administrative disappointment. There was no shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was a sigh, a clipboard note, a look that said, "You are a component, and you have malfunctioned." The SKU of failure flashed in her mind, bright and red. She was a defective item. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She just absorbed it. The numbness that had been a low hum in her veins for 5 years now became a total insulating silence. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of automatic movements. She was a body, performing tasks, while her mind had simply stopped. This was not the sharp, hot pain of the bankruptcy. That, at least, had been a feeling. This was the cold, heavy absence of feeling. This was the final stage of the resentment. It was no longer a fight. It was a surrender. The drive home was a grey smear, the world outside the windshield looking flat and colourless. She walked into the apartment. She was not looking for a grand conversation. She was not looking for solutions. She was not even looking for comfort. She was just a body, seeking a place to rest, a place that was not the warehouse. She was seeking, perhaps, the simple, unspoken validation of a shared presence, a signal that she was not, in fact, entirely alone in the universe. She needed a single human glance to confirm she was more than a malfunctioning inventory item. The television was off. The apartment was quiet but for the frantic, tiny tapping sounds coming from the sofa. Mark was there exactly as she had left him. He was a shape in the growing darkness of the living room, illuminated only by the cold blue light of his phone. He was not a person. He was a silhouette, a digital ghost. His entire consciousness poured into the small, bright rectangle in his hands. He did not look up. He may have grunted a hello, a sound of acknowledgement, but it was the sound one makes to a pet, not a partner. He was there, but he was not present. He was occupying space, completely and utterly unavailable, lost in a world that did not include her. The isolation was absolute. It was the stark, terrifying realization that she could cease to exist in this room, and it would not matter. It might take him hours to notice. She stood there for a long moment, invisible in her own home, the silence of the room more profound, more deafening than the industrial roar of the warehouse. This was the bottom, not a fiery crash, not a dramatic collapse. This was the quiet, suffocating finality of settling into the silt at the bottom of the ocean. There was no more fight. There was just the cold, the dark, and the pressure. This was the full weight of her life. She walked past him, a ghost of her own, and sat down at the dark kitchen table. She did not turn on the light. The question finally formed, rising up from the numbness. Not a question of anger, but of genuine, hollow curiosity. Is this all there is? This warehouse, this silence, this glowing blue light, is this the reward for being safe? This is the state that the ancient poets of the soul knew so well. It is the cry of the 42nd Psalm. Why are you so cast down, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? It is the recognition of the void. It is one abyss calling out to another. The deep, hollow emptiness inside her was finally and fully seeing the deep, hollow emptiness of the life surrounding her. This is the state the philosophers of meaning warned us about. It is the existential vacuum. It is the condition that sets in when a human being has enough to live with, but nothing to live for. The safe job provided a paycheck. The stagnant relationship provided a roof. Her life was a ledger sheet that balanced. She had survival, but she had no meaning. And the human soul cannot, for long, survive on survival alone. It demands a reason. The pain of her past, the resentment, had been her reason for years. But now even that was gone, replaced by this terrible, crushing apathy. She sat in the darkness, and for the first time a new and dangerous thought began to form. The fear of failure, the fear of change, the fear of her family's judgment, the fear of Mark's realism. All of these had been the walls of her prison. They were terrifying. But as she sat there invisible in the cold, dark kitchen, she realized that the walls, for all their terror, were no longer the most frightening thing in her life. The most terrifying thing was the prison itself, the absolute, unchanging, permanent grayness of this. And the question shifted, just slightly. When does the pain of staying exactly where you are become, finally, greater than the fear of taking a single, terrifying step? After the incident at the kitchen table, the numbness from the warehouse did not lift. It calcified. The apathy that had settled in, the cold, dark silt at the bottom of her soul, became her new operating system. She moved through the next few days on autopilot, a ghost in her own life. She went to the warehouse, she scanned the boxes. She came home. She sat in the silence next to the blue, glowing light of her companion's phone. The loop was complete. The prison was secure. But something had fractured. The final, crushing weight of that absolute isolation had created a hairline crack in the foundation of her surrender. One evening, the autopilot malfunctioned. She left the warehouse, but she did not turn toward home. She kept driving, her hands gripping the wheel, her mind as empty and grey as the twilight sky. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Mark. The lie came easily, a practiced motion of self-preservation. She said she was going to the storage unit, just to organize some old family boxes. He replied with an emoji, a simple thumbs up, a signal of his complete and total disinterest. He did not care where she was, as long as the routine was not disturbed. The lie, and his acceptance of it, gave her a small, cold pang of freedom. She pulled up to the row of identical metal garage doors. The storage facility was cold, anonymous and silent. She fumbled with the key, the cold metal biting into her fingers. With a loud, grinding shriek, she rolled the corrugated metal door up. The sound echoed in the empty lot, and it felt like the opening of a tomb. She stepped inside and pulled the door down, sealing herself in. For a moment, she stood in absolute darkness, the air thick with the smell of old paper, cold concrete and something else. Something sharp and alive. She found the pull cord and clicked on the single bare bulb, a weak yellow work light that cast harsh, deep shadows. The space was not filled with family boxes. It was a secret. It was a clandestine workshop, a hospital for the discarded. In the shadows sat chairs with 3 legs, small tables with deep scarred water rings, and dressers with broken drawers. They were the things she rescued from curbsides, items deemed lick-so by the world, just like her SKU of Failure. They were mirrors of herself. She ran her hand over a dusty oak chair, its finish cracked and peeling like old skin. She felt a kinship with it. It was broken, but the wood underneath was still good. The potential was still there, buried under the layers of neglect and damage. This is the work of the soul done in secret. The philosopher Jung taught that the parts of ourselves we repress, the parts we are ashamed of, do not simply vanish. They are relegated to the shadows, and they wait. Eliza's passion, her creativity, her builder's hands, this was her self, the core of her identity that she had been forced to hide, first from her family's expectations and now from her companion's cynicism. This storage unit was her shadow world, the only place this repressed part of her was allowed to exist. This was not a hobby. This was an act of individuation, the desperate, secret attempt of her soul to become whole, even in the dark. She plugged in the cord. She picked up the orbital sander. She placed it on the arm of the chair. The moment before she squeezed the trigger was thick with anticipation. Then she did it. The sudden, deafening roar of the tool shattered the silence. It was a violent, vibrating noise, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world. This was the antidote. The fluorescent buzz of the warehouse was the sound of her oppression, a low, constant hum that fed her resentment. But the roar of the sander was the sound of her power. It was so loud it drowned out every other voice. The supervisor, her mother Mark, her own internal critic, they were all for a moment completely obliterated by the noise. This is the sanctuary the soul craves. There is an ancient song, a cry of relief in the 18th Psalm that describes this exact feeling. It is the voice of a person who has been trapped in deep waters, suffocated by the ropes of the grave, who is suddenly miraculously pulled out. The song says, "He brought me out into a spacious place." That is what this cold 10 by 10 concrete box was for Eliza. The warehouse was constriction. The apartment was a cage. This tiny, secret room, filled with broken things, was the only spacious place her spirit had left to breathe. Here, she was not a component. She was a creator. She worked for an hour, maybe 2. Time dissolved. The internal monologue of resentment and paralysis was gone. There was only the physical reality of the moment, the pressure of her hand, the vibration of the tool, the smell of the fine oak dust, the magic of the new, raw, smooth wood emerging from beneath the old, ugly paint. She was not just sanding a chair. She was sanding away the layers of failure. She was restoring herself. When she finally turned the tool off, the silence that rushed back in was different. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of her home. It was a clean, empty, peaceful silence. The buzzing in her head, the voice of the shift manager, was quiet. Then the final tragic act of this ritual. She began to clean. With the same meticulous precision she used at the warehouse, she swept every particle of sawdust. She coiled the cord and put the sander back in its unmarked box. She wiped down the chair. She covered her work with a tarp. She erased all evidence of her existence, of her life. She hid her tools like they were contraband, like they were the evidence of a terrible crime. And this reveals the depth of her prison. The one and only thing in her entire world that gives her relief, the one act that quiets the trauma and allows her to be, is the very thing she is most ashamed of. The world has so thoroughly convinced her that her passion is the poison, that she now treats the antidote itself as a source of guilt. We are in the same warehouse, but the time is different. The main shift is over. The oppressive, chaotic energy of the production line has faded, leaving behind a vast, echoing quiet. The harsh overhead lights are off, replaced by the softer, intermittent safety lighting. This is a different kingdom, ruled by a different kind of presence. This is the domain of Señor Elpidio. He is a man in his later years, moving through the concrete canyons of the warehouse with a cart that squeaks rhythmically. He is the night janitor. He is, by the world's definition, at the bottom of the organizational chart. We watch him work, and we immediately see that he is not Eliza. He is not a component. He does not move with the hurried, resentful energy of someone enduring a sentence. His motions are economical, deliberate, and imbued with a strange, quiet dignity. He sweeps the long corridors, not with the frantic energy of fighting back an endless tide of dirt, but with the calm focus of someone restoring order to a small patch of the world. He is not at war with the mess. He is simply doing his work. There is no internal monologue of resentment. There is only the scrape of the broom and the squeak of the cart. This is the man Eliza sees but does not see. He is part of the building's machinery, like the fire extinguishers or the exit signs. But in this quiet moment, we watch him as a teacher, though he has no students. His cart rolls to a stop. He is sweeping near a loading bay, a place of constant breakage and debris. His eyes, clear and focused, spot something on the floor. It is a piece of a broken pallet, a small, triangular shard of hardwood, splintered at one end. To the day shift, this is just more lixo. It is waste. It is a problem to be swept away, another item for the landfill. It is, in essence, a rejected stone. Señor Elpidio stops. He leans his broom against the wall. He bends down, not with the groan of an old man, but with the deliberate motion of someone retrieving something of value. He picks up the wooden shard. He turns it over in his calloused hands. He inspects the grain, the weight of it. He sees the break not as the end of its life, but as a fact. He pulls a cloth from his pocket, wipes the diesel dust and grime from its surface, and instead of tossing it into the large trash receptacle on his cart, he places it carefully into a small, separate metal box. A box filled with other lixo, screws, bolts, stray washers. He sees potential. He sees a future use. He knows this hardwood is strong enough to be a shim, a brace, a patch for something else. He sees its next life. This is the entire philosophy. This single silent action is the key to the whole story. We must understand the profound difference between his world and Eliza's. Eliza's entire life is defined by what she has discarded, by the rejected stone of her past. Her failure is a massive, defining monument of trash that she cannot see past. She is her failure. It defines her. It dictates her present. But Elpidio, he is a man who actively looks for the value in what has been rejected. He does not see lixo. He sees raw material. His peace does not come from his station in life. His peace comes from his process. He is not trapped in the past result. He is fully engaged in the present moment act of restoration. This is the Stoic ideal in motion. This is precisely what the great emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote about in his private journals. He taught that our purpose, our virtue, is found only in the task directly in front of us. It does not matter if the task is ruling an empire or sweeping a floor. The quality of the action is the only thing we control. The title is irrelevant. The dignity is in the doing. Elpidio is not just a janitor. In this moment, he is a philosopher king, ruling the domain of the present moment with absolute virtue and focus. He is not thinking about the dirt of tomorrow. He is only cleaning the floor of today. This is a state of being so profound, it has been celebrated as the highest form of peace. There is an ancient, beautiful song, the 84th Psalm, that captures this exact feeling. It is a song of finding your place in the world, however humble. The poet says, "Even the sparrow has found a home and the swallow a nest for herself." The poet envies the porteros, the doorkeepers of the temple, finding more joy in that simple function than in any high-powered, chaotic life. Elpidio has found that. His purpose is clear. He is the restorer of order. He is the finder of the rejected. And in that simple, clear function, he has found a peace that eludes everyone else in this building. And so this is the solution, planted right in front of Eliza, though she does not yet have the eyes to see it. The answer to her paralysis, her resentment, and her existential void is not in a new idea, a new loan, or a new life. The answer is in this new perspective. It is in the single, quiet, revolutionary act of looking at the lixo of your life, the failure, the trauma, the shame, and asking not, why did this happen to me? But, what can I build with this? The contrast is a chasm. Why does this man, in the lowest, most invisible job in the entire warehouse, radiate a sense of peace that the managers and supervisors, and most certainly Eliza, would pay any price to possess? It was a Tuesday, but it felt like the end of the world. The warehouse, usually a place of monotonous, predictable noise, exploded into chaos. The shriek of metal, a shout, and then the unmistakable sound of a large barrel hitting the concrete floor. A forklift, turning too fast, had clipped a pallet. A drum of hydraulic oil was on its side, a thick, black rainbow slick spreading rapidly across the main corridor. It was an ugly, viscous flood, shutting down the entire line. The air filled with the acrid smell of the oil and the sharp, panicked anger of the supervisors. The logistics team was cursing. Radios crackled with frantic calls about cleanup protocols and lost time. This was a crisis. This was a delay. This was a mess. Eliza just stood there, her scanner hanging uselessly in her hand. She felt nothing. No panic, no urgency. Just a profound, bone-deep weariness. The chaos outside was just a reflection of the chaos inside. The spreading oil slick was, to her, a perfect metaphor for her own life. It was a permanent stain. It was the SKU of failure, her own personal bankruptcy, leaking out and proving that everything eventually breaks and contaminates its surroundings. This spill was not just an accident, it was an affirmation of her worldview. It was the universe itself, nodding along with her deepest held beliefs. It was saying, "See, it is all a mess. Nothing can be truly fixed. The stain always wins." She saw the futile efforts of the team to contain it with booms and felt a dark, cynical validation. "You can try," her internal monologue whispered, "but the stain always sinks into the concrete. It never really goes away." This is the nature of resentment. It is not just a memory of pain. It is an active, ongoing search for evidence to prove that the pain was justified, that the world is, in fact, broken. The oil slick was a feast for her trauma, a perfect, undeniable piece of evidence. This is why she was so apathetic. The event simply confirmed what she and Mark and her family already knew to be true. It is better not to try. Then, through the chaos, came the rhythmic squeak of a cart. Senor Elpidio. He was not running. He was not panicked. He pushed his janitorial cart with the same steady, unhurried pace he always used. He had a large, heavy bag of industrial absorbent, of sawdust, on the bottom of his cart. He parked, assessed the spill, and methodically began his work. He did not look at the angry supervisors. He did not look at the idle, frustrated workers. He only looked at the spill. Eliza, wrapped in her shroud of apathy, found herself standing near him as he prepared to cast the first shovelful of absorbent. She watched him, almost with pity. What a foolish, pointless job. The words slipped out of her before she could stop them, a bitter, quiet murmur of her own resignation. She told him it was a waste of time. She gestured to the vast, spreading stain. She said, "What is the point? Tomorrow, a different forklift will leak in a different spot. It will just get dirty again. It is always just dirty." It was her entire life philosophy, confessed in a single defeated sentence. It was the core belief of her resentment. She expected him to ignore her, or perhaps to agree with a weary sigh. He did neither. He did not even look up at her. He continued his work, scooping the sawdust and casting it skillfully over the darkest part of the spill. As he worked, his voice cut through her apathy. It was not loud, but it was clear. He replied simply that the floor of tomorrow does not exist yet. He said that the leak of tomorrow is not his problem. His only problem, his only job, is to clean the floor that is right here today. The words were so simple, so logical, they bypassed her defenses entirely. They hit her like a physical shock. It was a worldview so foreign to her, so utterly opposite to her own, that it momentarily stunned her. Her mind, which lived exclusively in the prison of yesterday's failure and tomorrow's anxiety, had no category for today's flaw. His words did not offer comfort. They offered a different reality. This is the moment. This is the collision of two entire universes. Her universe is built on time. Her identity is a monument to the past. Her resentment is the fuel, and her fear of the future is the wall. She is defined by the stain of 5 years ago. His universe is built on the now. He is not his past, he is not his future. He is a man cleaning a floor. We see in this interaction the core of all human suffering. We suffer, not because of what is happening, but because we are mentally elsewhere. We are like Eliza, agonizing over the unchangeable past or catastrophizing about the imaginary future. We are, essentially, never here. There is an ancient celebratory line of wisdom, a recognition of this very power. It declares, "This is the day, not yesterday, not tomorrow. This is the day." It is a command to the soul, an invitation to arrive fully in the only moment that actually exists. What Elpidio did was not just offer a folksy piece of wisdom. He handed her a key. He showed her that her prison of resentment and anxiety, which felt so solid, was an illusion. It was built of ghosts. The only thing that was real was the sawdust, the oil, and the concrete. His simple observation was a radical act of liberation, a blade of pure logic that severed the chains of her trauma loop. Eliza did not know what to say. She just stared at him as he worked. He was not fighting the stain. He was not cursing the forklift. He was not lamenting the state of the warehouse. He was just doing the work. He was absorbing the present moment, transforming it. He was not defined by the mess. He was the force acting upon the mess. The supervisors were still yelling. The oil was still there. Nothing about the external situation had changed. But for Eliza, the entire foundation of her reality had cracked. Why, she wondered, did that simple, logical sentence from a janitor feel more profound, more shaking, than years of advice from her family or her companion? Why did his peace, in the middle of this chaos, feel more real than her pain? The oil was cleaned up. The shifts returned to normal. The fluorescent hum settled back into its familiar oppressive groove, and the sound of the packing tape resumed its high-pitched, abrasive scream. Eliza was back at her station, her scanner in hand, a component back in the machine. From the outside, nothing had changed. She was still moving boxes, still registering inventory, still trapped in the steel-gray labyrinth of her life. But inside her mind, something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The old familiar monologue of her resentment, the constant obsessive recatalogues of the SKU of failure, was still playing, but it was no longer the only sound. It had a counterpoint. A simple sentence had become a pebble in her shoe, an irritant in her mind she could not dislodge. But the floor of tomorrow does not exist yet. This phrase, spoken by a man she had never truly seen, kept echoing. It was not a beautiful, poetic, or spiritual phrase. It was aggressively simple. It was blunt, it was logical, and that is what made it so deeply, profoundly, and infuriatingly disruptive. Her entire identity, her entire prison, was built on the complex, tangled architecture of the past and the future. Her resentment feasted on yesterday. Her paralysis was fed by the terror of tomorrow. The simple, brute force reality of today was a concept she had not considered for 5 years. She found herself distracted, her focus slipping. She would be sealing a box and her hands would just stop. She would be staring at her computer screen at home, the ledger of their bills, and the numbers would blur. Mark would be talking, his voice a familiar drone of realism and quiet cynicism. And she would nod, but she was not listening to him. She was listening to the echo. She was replaying the scene of the oil spill, not her own apathy, but Elpidio's calm. The chaos of the spill, the shouting, the panic, and this one man in the eye of the storm, moving with a purpose that was not frantic but steady. He was not reacting. He was acting. She began to watch him. Her observation, once passive, now became active. It was an obsession. She saw him in the hallways, pushing his cart. She watched him in the cafeteria, wiping down the tables. She studied him as one would study an alien, a creature who operated by a different set of laws. He was not, she realized, a happy-go-lucky fool. He was not a man whistling while he worked, ignorant of the world's miseries. His face was not smiling. It was simply present. His eyes were not lost in a daydream. They were focused on the smudge on the table in front of him. His movements were not lazy. They were precise. This is the moment the old stories call the seed of doubt. But it is not a doubt in the self. It is a doubt in the misery. Eliza's entire life was built on the bedrock assumption that her pain was the only reality, that her failure was the defining truth of the universe. Elpidio's peace was a direct contradiction to that truth. His calm was a challenge to her chaos. His presence was an accusation against her absence. This is the call to adventure. It is the moment the herald, the most unlikely of messengers, appears. It is not a trumpet blast. It is the squeak of a janitor's cart, delivering a message that shatters the hero's ordinary world of pain. It is the whisper that says, "There is another way to be." Her mind, an expert in its own suffering, tried to dismiss him. It told her he was simple, he was just a janitor. He had no ambitions, so he had no failures. His peace was not wisdom, it was just ignorance. It was the peace of a man who did not know any better. But she could not make the argument stick. She had seen his eyes. She had seen him pick up that rejected piece of wood. It was not ignorance. It was attention. It was a different kind of intelligence, one she had lost. The Zen masters, the philosophers of the present, have a name for this. They call it beginner's mind. It is the ability to see the world as it is, fresh, without the thick, dirty filter of past experiences. Elpidio was just sweeping. Eliza, by contrast, had expert's mind. She was a world-class expert on her own failure, and that expertise, that obsessive knowledge of her past, was the very thing that made it impossible for her to be here. She was never just scanning a box. She was a failure scanning a box. She was never just sitting at home. She was a woman trapped in a stagnant relationship. Her past was not her past. It was a permanent, distorting lens she wore, a lens that painted every single moment of her present with the colors of her trauma. Elpidio, however, in his humble function, seemed to have no lens at all. He was just cleaning the floor. This question, this enigma, became a quiet, consuming fire. His peace felt like a personal affront. It unsettled her. It terrified her. Because if his peace was real, if it was an attainable skill and not just a lucky draw personality, then that meant her pain was not as solid and inevitable as she believed. It meant her prison was not perhaps made of steel. It meant, most terrifyingly of all, that the door might not even be locked. The ancient seekers who wrote the 90th Psalm understood this hunger. They pleaded with the universe, "Teach us to number our days." This is not a morbid countdown to death. It is a desperate plea for wisdom. It is a request to be taught how to be present, to understand the value of this day, the only one we have, the only floor we can clean. Eliza was realizing, with a creeping sense of horror, that she had not truly lived in a day for 2,000 days. She had been existing in a mausoleum of memory, and this quiet old man with his broom and his cart was the first person to show her that she was in fact already dead. The obsession was no longer just curiosity, it was becoming a necessity. It was the question that would change everything. Is his peace real? And if it is, how do I get it? The fight was inevitable. The tension that had been coiling in their apartment for weeks, her distraction, her obsession with the janitor, his clinging, terrified realism, finally snapped. It began, as it always did, with something small. A minor miscalculation in their online checkbook, a few dollars unaccounted for. But Mark, his nerves already frayed by her new, strange distance, did not see a simple error. He saw a symptom. He saw the return of the sickness. He saw the ghost of the shop. His voice was not loud, but it was heavy, weighted with the martyrdom of his own practicality. He asked her if she was drifting off again. He asked her if she was getting those ideas. He brought up the debt. He brought up the incident. He weaponized their shared history, using the failure of their past to terrorize her present. He called the bankruptcy a lesson, and then he asked her, his voice a quiet, cutting blade of resentment, why she was the only one who could not seem to learn it. This time his words did not just paralyze her, they shattered her. The insulating numbness, the grey, apathetic fog she had been living in, cracked open, and what lay underneath was not anger, but a raw, profound and bottomless grief. He was right. She was the stain. She was the one who had burned their life down. She was the permanent, unfixable error. She fled the apartment. She did not know where she was going. His final words followed her, accusing her of being unstable. She drove, her hands shaking, tears blurring the oncoming headlights. The car, as if guided by some deeper, unconscious instinct, found its way to the warehouse. It was late. His shift. She parked in the vast, empty lot, the building looming over her like a silent, steel-grey mountain. Her heart was pounding, a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. A wave of shame, so powerful it was nauseating, washed over her. What was she doing? She was a logistics worker, skulking in the parking lot, off shift, to find the janitor. This was pathetic. Her internal critic, the voice of her failure, was screaming. It told her she was a fool, that this was the final proof of her instability. She was a failure, and now she was a crazy failure. She put her hand on the gear shift, ready to reverse, to flee back to the cold, familiar prison of her home. But the echo of Mark's voice, "You haven't learned your lesson," stopped her. That, she realized, was the one true thing that had been said. She had not learned. She was trapped in the loop. And this man, this Elpidio, he was the only person she had ever seen who seemed to live outside of a loop. She had to know. The walk from the car to the employee entrance was the longest of her life. Every squeak of her shoes on the polished concrete felt like a confession of her inadequacy. She was trespassing, breaking the unwritten rules of her own prison, the rules that demanded she suffer in silence, that she hide her brokenness. Her pride, the same pride that had kept her isolated for 5 years, was roaring, telling her to turn back, that this was undignified. It was the voice of her expert mind, the part of her that was an expert in her own trauma, fighting to maintain its control. It knew instinctively that this simple old man was a threat to its entire, carefully constructed universe of pain. She found him where she knew he would be, the small, sterile break room, its silence broken only by the incessant, low-frequency hum of the vending machine. He was there, sitting at a formica table, a simple thermos in front of him. He was just sitting. He was on his break. He looked up as she pushed the door open, her presence a violation of the quiet. His eyes were clear. They were not surprised, not curious, not judgmental. They were just observant. He did not speak. He just waited. The silence stretched, and Eliza stood in the doorway, feeling small, feeling like a child, her entire, complex, adult life of pain and failure reduced to this one awkward, humiliating moment. She had to speak. The words felt like they were being torn from her, raw and fractured. She said his name. She said she knew this was strange. She stammered, trying to explain. She said she had seen him. She had seen him in the warehouse with the oil, the day of the spill. She looked at the floor, at her own feet, unable to meet his gaze. And then she asked it, the question that had been consuming her, the only metaphor she had left. "How?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How do you deal with stains?" She finally looked up, her eyes pleading. "How do you deal with the ones that don't come out? The errors that you just can't clean up? This is the moment. This is not weakness. We have been taught to see this vulnerability as a failure of spirit. We are told to be strong, to be resilient, to fake it until you make it. But this is a profound misunderstanding of strength. True strength is not the absence of brokenness. It is the courage to stand in the middle of your own wreckage and finally ask for help. This is the moment the mystics and the poets have always written about. This is the crack. This is the wound. This is the only place, as the poet Rumi wrote, where the light can possibly enter. We mistake this act for surrender, but it is the first act of war against the real enemy. The real enemy is not the failure. It is the pride that insists on suffering alone. It is the ego that would rather be right about its own misery than be humble enough to be healed. Eliza's shame, her terror of looking foolish in this break room, was the final guard at the prison door. By walking through that door, by choosing to be vulnerable over being right about her own stain, she performed the first true act of liberation. This is the profound hidden wisdom in the 34th Psalm. It is a promise not that we will never be broken, but that there is a presence that draws near specifically to the broken-hearted. It does not celebrate the strong. It saves the crushed in spirit. Elpidio did not react. He did not seem startled by her question, nor did he seem burdened by the raw, desperate pain behind it. He simply held her gaze, his calmness a stark, unsettling contrast to her frantic energy. He let the question, "How do you deal with the stains that won't come out?" hang in the sterile, buzzing air of the break room. He took a slow sip from his thermos. The silence he left was not an empty one. It was an active one. It was a space he was holding, forcing her to be present with the weight of what she had just asked. He was not going to rush in with an easy answer, a platitude or a dismissal. He was, she realized, truly listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, matter of fact. He told her she was looking at the stain all wrong. He said she looked at her failure, her stain from 5 years ago, like it was the oil spill in the corridor. Something ugly, something permanent, something to be scrubbed, to be hidden, to be ashamed of. He said she was spending all her energy trying to erase a mark on a flaw that was already in the past. She was, he said, scrubbing the wrong flaw. Eliza just stared, confused. The metaphor was failing. She was talking about her life. He was talking about janitorial work. The gap between them felt vast. He leaned forward just slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. He told her that where he came from they read an old story, a very old song. He said it was in the 118th Psalm. He spoke the line, not like a preacher, but like a craftsman, sharing a technical secret. He said, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Eliza's mind, conditioned by years of secular cynicism, immediately tried to categorize it. She dismissed it. It is just a church phrase. It is a nice religious idea. It means nothing. It is just a line from a book. She felt a flash of frustration, of disappointment. She had come here, humiliated herself, for empty poetry. Elpidio seemed to read her mind. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice firm, cutting through her dismissal. "It is not a church phrase. It is not poetry. It is a manual. It is a set of building instructions." He held her gaze. He told her that she was treating her failure, her rejected stone, like it was trash. Like it was that oil, something to be absorbed and thrown in the dump. She hides it. She lets her companion use it as an anchor to keep her trapped. She lets her family use it as a reason to keep her small. She had built her entire life around the idea that this one terrible broken stone was the end of her story. But what if, he asked, it is not the end of the construction? What if it is the foundation? This question landed with the force of a physical blow. Eliza could not breathe. He continued. He told her that the thing she learned in the fire, the lesson that came from that specific, painful, ugly failure, that is the only thing she has that nobody else has. That is her strength. She is not destined to repeat the mistake. She is destined to use the mistake. The stone was not rejected because it was worthless. It was rejected because the original builders were fools. They did not understand its true purpose. His eyes held hers. He asked the final, devastating question, "What did you learn from that stone that nobody else knows?" This is the moment of pure alchemical transformation. This is not just advice. It is a complete reframing of reality. This is the core of all psychological healing. It is the art of resignification, of re-signing meaning. He did not tell her the failure did not happen. He did not tell her to get over it. He did not offer comfort. He did something far more radical. He validated the stone. He gave it a function. He transformed it from a monument of shame into a tool of construction. He took the SKU of failure, the source of her resentment and paralysis, and recategorized it as her single greatest asset. He turned the poison into the antidote. The philosopher Jung spent his entire life exploring this very concept. He taught that the stone is the shadow. It is the part of ourselves we reject, the part we are ashamed of, the part we hide in the darkness. Just as Eliza hides her woodworking in the storage unit, we spend our lives trying to run from this shadow, or trying to pretend it does not exist. But Jung's great discovery, the secret of individuation, of becoming a whole person, is that the shadow is not the enemy. It is the source. It contains all the power, all the raw material, all the gold that we are missing. Elpidio, this humble janitor, was acting as a master alchemist, inviting Eliza to stop running from her shadow and, for the first time, to turn, face it, and pick it up. And pick. Eliza had no answer to his question. What had she learned? Her mind, which had spent 5 years cataloguing the pain of the failure, had never once been asked to catalogue the data from it. The question created a new file in her brain. It was a click, so loud it silenced the buzzing in her head. The break room, the vending machine hum, Elpidio's quiet presence, it all snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. He had given her the key. He had shown her that her prison was not a prison at all. It was a quarry, and the very thing she hated most about herself was in fact the only tool she had to build her way out. The drive home was a blur. Mark was asleep, his side of the bed a silent, unmoving territory. Eliza did not go to bed. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark, the same spot where she had hit the bottom, where she had felt the crushing void. But this time the darkness was not empty. It was vibrating. It was filled with a single, massive, terrifying question. What did you learn? Elpidio's words had unlocked a door in her mind, a room that had been sealed shut for 5 years, and now she was standing in the doorway, afraid to look at what was inside. Her rejected stone, her failure. For half a decade she had treated it as a single, solid block of shame, a monolith of pain. Now Elpidio's question was forcing her to look closer, to see it not as a solid block, but as a composite, a thing made of many smaller pieces. She was still. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she did not just feel the trauma of the fire, she analyzed it. What had actually happened? She had failed. Yes. But why? Her mind, hesitant at first, then gaining speed, began to produce the inventory. The SKU of failure was not one item, it was hundreds. She had learned about cash flow. Or rather, she had learned in the most brutal way possible about the lack of it. She had learned that passion and a good product were not enough. She had learned about marketing, that just being there did not mean people would come. She had learned about her audience, that what she thought they wanted was completely different from what they actually bought. She had learned about inventory management, the fatal flaw of having too much of the wrong thing and not enough of the right. She had learned about the stress of debt, how it poisoned every decision. The failure was not a single incident. It was a 5-year, intensive and horrifically expensive education. This new awareness, this seeing, was painful. It was a different kind of pain from the dull ache of resentment. This was the sharp, clarifying pain of the truth. She had not just failed, she had made specific, definable, knowable mistakes. This new knowledge was exhilarating, and then almost immediately it was suffocating. She opened her eyes. She was still in her kitchen. Mark was still in the other room. Her job at the warehouse was still waiting for her in the morning. She had this new profound insight, and absolutely nothing to do with it. She felt a surge of strength, quickly followed by a crushing wave of despair. So this is the trap. This is the cruel joke of consciousness. We see our pattern, but we remain bound by it. There is an ancient, desperate cry for this exact state, a plea found in the 3rd Psalm. It is the voice of a soul who is surrounded by enemies. The soul cries out, "Many are saying of me, there is no help for him." This is what Eliza felt. Her new awareness was just another enemy. Her internal critic, her paralysis, and the external voice of Mark, her anchor, all seem to say the same thing. It is great that you see your failure. It changes nothing. There is still no help for you. You are still the stain. She carried this new, heavy awareness with her for days. It made her life paradoxically harder. Before, she had the cold comfort of her resentment, the apathy of the void. Now she was awake. She was a prisoner who was, for the first time, fully aware of the bars. This new consciousness made her attempt something she had not tried in years. She tried to apply it. One evening, she attempted to have a real, constructive conversation with Mark. She sat him down. She tried to use her new language. She told him, her voice trembling, that she had been thinking about the shop, about what they had learned. She started to explain her new insight, that maybe the failure was not an end, but an education, that maybe their rejected stone was a foundation. She was trying to share Elpidio's gift with him. She was trying to free them both. But Mark did not see a gift. He saw a threat. He saw the return of the sickness, the ideas that had almost destroyed them. His face hardened. His realism became a weapon. He asked her, his voice dripping with cynical pity, if she was serious. A lesson? He said it was a $50,000 lesson. He said, "Are you having this conversation again? We are finally stable. We are safe. And you want to—" "What? Talk about that nightmare. You clearly learned nothing at all." The words hit her, and her new, fragile consciousness collapsed. He was right. She was a fool. She had taken a janitor's cryptic phrase and tried to turn it into a life strategy. She retreated, the shame hot on her face. She was back in the box. The old pattern, the old dynamic was stronger than her new insight. The habits of their relationship, the rules of their shared prison, were too powerful. She fell back into the old routine, but with a new, agonizing pain. It was the pain, not of being asleep, but of being awake and still completely paralyzed. She now knew her problem. She could see it, name it, analyze it, and she still could not, for the life of her, change it. The Stoic philosophers like Epictetus would have diagnosed her error immediately. She had failed not because her insight was wrong, but because she had applied it incorrectly. She had tried to change what she could not control, the mind of another person. She had tried to convince her cellmate to love freedom. She had focused her new energy on the one thing in her universe that was guaranteed to resist it: Mark's fear. She had forgotten the other, secret part of her life. She had forgotten the storage unit. She had forgotten her tools. She had forgotten that the first rule of building is to build. The failure of that conversation with Mark plunged her into a new kind of despair. It was the despair of the almost. She had seen the way out, but the door had been slammed in her face, locked from the inside by her own life. The warehouse became her only reality again, a grey, predictable world that, while soul-crushing, at least made sense. She was a component. She stacked boxes. She avoided Mark. She stopped thinking about stones. The apathy was returning, a welcome, numbing blanket. But the seed of Elpidio's question, though buried, was not dead. It was just dormant, waiting. She found herself, almost against her will, seeking him out. She needed to see him again, not even to talk, but just to confirm that his peace was real, that she had not imagined it. She found him in the break room, just as before, on his break. She stood in the doorway, feeling foolish, a repeat of her first desperate visit. He looked up, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. She did not even know what to say. She just stammered, "I tried." She told him she had tried to look at the stone, but it was no use. She said, "I failed again. I cannot change it. He will not let me." Elpidio listened. He finished the coffee in his thermos. He screwed the cap on, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, his eyes clear, and told her that she was still scrubbing the wrong floor. He asked her why she was trying to convince a man who was afraid of heights to climb a mountain. His mind, he said, was not her floor to clean. She did not have to convince her companion of anything. She just had to build. He told her she was focusing on the wrong thing. She was focusing on the problem, her resentment, her relationship, her past. She should instead focus on the solution. He motioned to her a small gesture. "You have the stone," he said. "Your failure is your data. It taught you what people need. And you have the tools. You have a passion." Eliza was confused. "How did you know?" He just smiled, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. "I see the sawdust on your shoes sometimes, the way you look at a broken pallet." He leaned forward. "Stop trying to fix your past. That is Mark's job, not yours. Your job is to build the future. You have a gift in your hands and a lesson in your head that no one else has. That is not an accident. He told her to stop focusing on herself, on her pain. He said the way out of the self is to serve someone else. This was the second key. The first key, the rejected stone, had shown her what her power was. This second key, this ikigai lesson, showed her how to use it. It was a radical reorientation. Her entire life had been an inward spiral of self-obsessed pain, her resentment, her failure, her paralysis, her fear. It was a closed loop. Elpidia was offering her the only way out, an outward-facing motion, service. He was telling her to stop trying to heal herself and instead to use her unique wound to heal someone else. He was giving her the central lesson of logotherapy. Meaning is not found in introspection, it is found in auto-transcendence. She left the break room, and this time the world looked different. The buzzing of the lights seemed quieter, the steel shelves seemed less like a prison and more like just shelves. The revelation was not loud and explosive. It was a deep, quiet, structural shift. Her focus, which had been locked on Mark, on her family, on her past, had just been released. She did not have to fix him. She did not have to get their permission. She did not have to justify her hobby. She just had to find someone to serve. Her rejected stone, her brutal education in cash flow, marketing and inventory, was not a source of shame. It was her curriculum vitae. Her hidden passion, her woodworking, was not a guilty secret. It was her tool set. She finally understood. Her resentment was a self-focused energy. Her paralysis was a self-focused fear. The antidote had to be other-focused. The way to stop being a failure was to stop thinking about being a failure and to start being a solution. This is the great paradox of purpose. The meaning we crave for ourselves is only ever found when we stop looking for it and instead focus on creating it for others. This is the essence of the ikigai, the Japanese concept of a reason for being. It is the intersection, what you love, woodworking, what you are good at, the hard lessons from your failure, and what the world needs. Elpidio had given her the map. He had shown her that her two biggest problems, her shameful failure and her useless passion, were, in fact, the two coordinates that, when combined, marked the treasure. She did not need Mark's approval. She did not need her family's blessing. She did not even need to quit her job. She just needed to find one person, one single person in the world, who needed the specific solution that only her unique combination of pain and passion could provide. The question was no longer, how do I escape? The question for the first time was, who can I help? She went to the storage unit that night. The lie to Mark was easier this time, almost automatic. He was deep in his digital world, anchored to the sofa, and barely registered her leaving. The roll of the metal door still shrieked, but to Eliza it no longer sounded like a tomb. It sounded like an opportunity. She pulled the string on the yellow work light, and the familiar dusty space was illuminated. Her hospital for the discarded was waiting. But she saw it all differently now. These broken chairs and scarred tables were not just metaphors for her own brokenness. They were raw material. They were potential. She stood in the center of the cold concrete room, the lesson from Elpidio echoing in her head, find someone to serve. The ikigai map was open in her mind. Her passion, woodworking. Her rejected stone, the brutal practical lessons of her failed business. She looked at an ugly, squat 1980s-era desk she had rescued from a curb. It was the kind of furniture nobody wanted. It was her. It was a rejected stone, and she was going to make it her first act of service. She was going to build. But as she reached for her tools, a voice cold and familiar spoke in her mind. It was not her voice. It was a chorus. It was the synthesized, venomous blend of her own internal critic, Mark's cynical realism, and her mother's anxious warnings. Who do you think you are? The voice was not a whisper. It was a shout. You are not a builder. You are a warehouse worker. You are a failure. It was the sound of her paralysis, her perfectionism, rising up with a vengeance. You are going to do this again. You are going to take this piece of Lixo and pretend it is a business. You are going to humiliate yourself all over again. The voice was precise, surgical. You are not good enough. This is not perfect. You will fail. You always fail. The sander felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The resistance was a physical force, a thick, invisible tar she had to push through. This is the moment. This is the test. The philosophers of discipline, the writers like Stephen Pressfield, have a name for this. This is the resistance. It is not just doubt. It is an active, malevolent, and intelligent force of self-sabotage. Its sole purpose is to keep you from doing your work. It rises, not when you are weak, but when you are finally strong. It appears not when you are aimless, but when you are finally standing at the threshold of your true calling. The fact that the voice was this loud was not a sign she was wrong. It was the definitive proof that she was, for the first time, exactly right. She stood there, frozen, the tool in her hand caught in the crossfire between Elpidio's calm instruction and the screaming terror of her own past. The paralysis was absolute. You will fail, and Mark will say, "I told you so," and your mother will be so disappointed, and you will be back at square one, but with less money and more shame. Just put the tool down. Go home. Be safe. The argument was so logical. It was the logic of the prison. Safety, security, the avoidance of pain. Her hand trembled. She was losing. The fear was stronger than the new, fragile idea of purpose. But then another voice spoke. It was not hers, it was not Mark's, it was Elpidio's. It was his simple, logical phrase, "You are scrubbing the wrong floor." She was doing it again. She was focusing on the result. She was catastrophizing about the future. She was ruminating on the past. She was focusing on herself, on her fear of judgment. Elpidio's second lesson cut through the noise. Stop focusing on yourself. Serve someone else. This was the antidote. She realized her perfectionism was just a profound form of selfishness. It was a fear of what she would look like, how she would be perceived if she failed. The way to beat the fear was to make it irrelevant, to make the work not about her but about them. Who was them? She thought about her old neighborhood. She thought about the tiny apartments, the people like her, working from home on kitchen tables. That was the need. Her stone, the failure, had taught her that people did not want art. They wanted solutions. Her passion, the woodworking, was the tool. She was not just restoring a desk. She was creating a work-from-home solution for tiny, struggling spaces. The shift was immediate. The work was no longer about her. It was about them. The paralysis broke. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the sander filled the room, obliterating the voice of the resistance. She was not just sanding wood. She was sanding away 5 years of caked-on shame. The ancient poets, in the 55th Psalm, gave voice to that internal terror. They wrote of a heart in anguish, of the terrors of death falling upon them, of being overwhelmed by dread. That was the voice of her paralysis. But by focusing on service, she had found the wings to fly above it. She was no longer a failure trying to be perfect. She was a builder, imperfectly, but finally doing the work. She made the decision that night, in the roaring, sawdust-filled sanctuary of the storage unit. The decision was not grand. It was not a declaration to the world. It was a quiet, internal pivot. She was not going to quit her job. She was not going to confront Mark. She was not going to do anything that her resistance could use as a weapon. She was going to do something small, strategic, and real. She looked at her small savings account on her phone. It was the safety money, the fund her family was so proud of, the barrier between her and total ruin. It was the physical manifestation of her family script. This was the test. The philosophers of action, from the Stoics to the existentialists, all agree on one thing. A belief is not a belief until it is acted upon. An idea, no matter how profound, is just a ghost until it is made real through a choice, through a sacrifice. Her new Ikigai philosophy, her rejected stone manual, it was all just poetry, just like her critic said, until she was willing to bet on it. She was being asked to make a salto de fe, a leap of faith. But it was not a blind leap. It was a leap from one kind of faith to another. She had to choose, faith in the safety of her prison, or faith in the purpose of her stone. She looked at the ugly, half-sanded desk. Her plan, born from her stone, was clear. This desk was not just a piece of furniture, it was a prototype. She was going to apply her lessons. Lesson 1, cash flow. She would not go into debt. She would use this small savings, her safety, to buy the high-quality materials to do this one project right. Lesson 2, marketing. She would not just hope, she would go directly to where the need was. Lesson 3, value. She would not just make it pretty, she would make it useful, redesigning it for small spaces, adding features she knew people needed. Her finger hovered over the transfer button on her banking app. The voice of her paralysis, her perfectionism screamed, "This is the money for the rent. This is the just-in-case fund. You are burning the lifeboats. You are setting the fire yourself this time." It was the sound of her family script, the voice of generations of fear, pleading with her to choose security over meaning. It was the voice of Mark's realism, whispering that this was the exact same foolish impulse that had destroyed them. The terror was immense. The calm, terrifying moment of the true irreversible choice was upon her. This is the ultimate existential choice. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this the anxiety of freedom. It is the moment we realize we are not just actors reading a script, we are the authors. And the blank page is terrifying. For 5 years, Eliza had the comfort of her script. Her role was the failure. It was a miserable part, but she knew her lines. To choose this new path, to buy the tools, was to throw the script away. It was to accept the terrifying, agonizing, and glorious burden of being responsible for her own life. She was choosing to leap, not into the void or into chaos, but to leap into herself. She hit the button. The money moved. She ordered the lumber, the new hardware, the high-quality varnish. The act was done. The ships were burned. The feeling that washed over her was not, as she had expected, euphoria. It was not joy. It was a profound, cold, and utterly terrifying calm. She had just wagered her entire safe existence on a janitor's philosophy. She had just bet her life, not on a guaranteed outcome, but on a process. She was trusting, for the first time, not in a paycheck, but in her stone. She was trusting that her greatest shame was, in fact, her greatest asset. This is the wisdom of the 20th Psalm. It is a warrior's song before a battle. The poet declares that some will trust in their chariots, their horses, their external visible signs of power and security. But the poet says, we will trust in a different source. Eliza had just made that choice. Her family, Mark, her supervisor, they all trusted in the chariots of the stable job, the paycheck, the 401k. They trusted in the tangible. Eliza, in this quiet, dusty room, had just placed her trust in the intangible. She had placed her trust in her purpose, in the value hidden within her own rejected stone. The battle was not yet won, but for the first time she had finally, truly, chosen her side. The materials arrived. The small cold storage unit was suddenly filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine and the sharp chemical smell of varnish. The arrival of the boxes, paid for with her safety money, made the choice real. There was no turning back. This was not a hobby anymore, it was a test. And as she began to work, she discovered a new, more insidious layer of her paralysis. The work itself, which had once been her secret joy, her escape, was now fraught with a terrible pressure. Every cut had to be perfect, every joint had to be seamless, every layer of stain had to be flawless. Her perfectionism, which had previously served as a theoretical barrier to starting the work, now mutated into a brutal, micromanaging tyrant that critiqued every step of the work. The voice of her internal critic was relentless. That cut is not square. The sander left a swirl mark. You are using too much glue. This is amateur. This is junk. It was the voice of her SKU of Failure, reminding her that her last attempt at professional work was a disaster. It was trying to protect her from the humiliation of creating another flawed product, of proving her critics right. The work slowed to a crawl. She spent hours measuring a single cut, paralyzed by the fear of ruining the expensive wood. But the real test, The true teste da realidade came after the desk was finally finished. She had pushed through the paralysis, not by defeating it, but by outlasting it, by clinging to Elpidio's command to serve. She had redesigned the ugly desk, applying her rejected stone lessons. It was now compact, ergonomic, with hidden compartments for power strips and a clever pull-out writing surface, a perfect solution for a tiny apartment. She took pictures of it, her hands shaking, and wrote a post. She did not try to sell it, her paralysis would not let her. Instead, she offered it on a local community forum in exchange for honest, brutal feedback. Then she waited, and the silence was deafening. Nothing. For 1 day, then 2, then 3. The post on the forum sank, buried under requests for babysitters and ads for used bicycles. The silence was 1,000 times worse than the noise of her critic. The silence was the world's indifference. It was the universe confirming her deepest fear. She was invisible. Her stone was worthless. Her passion was a joke. The desk, which she had poured her last reserves of hope and money into, sat in the storage unit, a monument to her foolishness. The failure was instant, absolute, and humiliating. She went to the warehouse, the hollowness inside her so vast it was a physical ache. She had sacrificed her safety, she had burned her ships, only to discover that the new world did not want her. She had failed. Again. But this time the failure was quieter, colder, and somehow more final. The first time she had the fire, the drama, the incident. This time she just had nothing. The indifference of the world was the ultimate judgment. It was the market, the void, whispering, "You do not matter. Your solution solves nothing. Your service is not required." This was the test that the Stoics wrote about. This is the moment the obstacle appears. The obstacle, the philosophers like Seneca taught, is not an interruption of the path. The obstacle is the path. The silence of the forum was not a rejection of her work. It was a test of her conviction. Was she doing this for the validation, for the likes and the quick feedback? Or was she doing this because it was her purpose? Was her worth tied to the market's immediate response, or was it tied to the act of building itself? This was the test she was failing. Her new ikigai identity was so fragile that it was being shattered not by criticism, but by mere silence. And just as this new despair was calcifying, Mark delivered the final crushing blow. He had seen the forum post. He had found it, perhaps by searching for her name, driven by his own anxieties. He did not yell. He did not say, "I told you so." He did something far more devastating. He showed her pity. He found her in the kitchen and put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture so rare it felt alien. He told her gently that it was okay. He said he saw her little ad and that it was a nice try. He told her, "Eliza, nobody wants that stuff. It is okay. You do not have to keep trying. We have the warehouse. We are safe." His pity was the poison. His "I told you so" would have been a fight, but his "it is okay," that was a sentence. It was the sound of the cell door locking. He was not just an anchor. He was a benevolent warden, assuring her that her attempt at escape was cute, but that her true place was here in the prison they shared. His words, combined with the crushing silence of the world, were the validation her paralysis had been waiting for. It was the ultimate proof. The experiment was over. She was a failure. The stone was just a stone. The warehouse was her destiny. She was a ghost. The failure of the desk, the deep, profound, and crushing silence of the world's indifference, had hollowed her out. The numbness she had felt after the oil spill, the existential void she had touched in her kitchen, was now her permanent state. She went to the warehouse, she scanned, she moved. She was the perfect employee. She was, in fact, reliability made manifest. She was a component in the machine that had finally, totally, and completely surrendered to its function. She had no hope. She had no ideas. She was just a pair of hands, an eye for a scanner, a body that showed up on time. And it was this very state, this complete and total death of her spirit, that the world was about to reward. Her supervisor found her on the line. He called her name and she registered it, but without emotion. He asked her to come to the office. The office was quiet. The carpet was clean. The fluorescent lights somehow buzzed at a softer, more managerial frequency. It was the room where decisions were made, the prison confortable that floated above the concrete floor of the warehouse. Her supervisor, a man with a tired face and a spreadsheet open on his monitor, gestured for her to sit. She sat. He did not look at her. He looked at the screen. He told her she had been with them for a long time. He said she was reliable. That word again. Not creative, not brilliant, not insightful. Reliable. The ultimate praise for a cog. He told her the afternoon shift supervisor was moving to a different branch. He said the position was open. He said it was hers, if she wanted it. More pay, more responsibility, better benefits. Security. It was the family script finally come true. It was the materialization of her parents' prayers. It was the ultimate, logical, and safe next step. It was the reward for her 5 years of loyal, numb, and obedient suffering. It was, in essence, the perfect, well-lit, and comfortable prison cell offered with a smile. This is the great, terrifying paradox of the human soul. This is what the philosophers of freedom, like Erich Fromm, identified as our deepest, most secret terror. We believe we want freedom. We write songs about it. We fight wars for it. But true freedom, the absolute crushing and existential burden of being responsible for your own choices, your own meaning, your own stone, is an anxiety that most of us cannot bear. When that anxiety becomes too great, as it had for Eliza when her desk was met with silence, we are offered an escape. It is the escape from freedom. It is the moment we are tempted to trade the agonizing, unsupported work of building our own life for the comforting, secure, and predefined role of a supervisor. Eliza heard the offer, but the words sounded strange, as if spoken underwater. This was success. This was the win. This was the exact thing that would make her family and Mark finally breathe a sigh of relief. This was the proof that she had learned her lesson and settled down. She could feel the walls of this new, safer, better prison closing in on her. It was an escape, not from the warehouse, but from the terrifying, demanding silence of her storage unit. It was the world seeing her failure, seeing her pain, and offering her a golden anesthetic bribe to simply stop, to give up, to be reliable forever. She told him she would think about it. She walked out of the office, back onto the loud, dirty floor. The noise of the line felt different, thinner. That night, she told Mark. His reaction was not just positive, it was explosive. It was the first genuine, unadulterated joy she had seen in his face in half a decade. He was saved. They were saved. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes bright. He told her this was it. This was what they had been waiting for. They were safe. He implored her to take it, to say yes immediately. He told her to forget those stupid, broken tables. He told her, his voice cracking with a desperate, pleading relief, to just, please, be normal. His joy was the heaviest chain she had ever felt. His relief was the final lock. All the voices of her world, her mother's fear, her father's pragmatism, her supervisor's spreadsheet, and now the desperate, begging hope of her own companion, were all singing the exact same song. They were all pushing her toward this one, sensible, logical, and soul-destroying choice. This is the moment the ancient poets in the 73rd Psalm cried out about. It is the confession of a soul on a hard, stony path, looking over at the people on the easy road, the prosperous, the safe, the ones who seem to have no struggles. The poet admits, "My feet almost slipped." Eliza was at that edge. The promotion was the safe road. It was the prosperity of the prison. It was the world offering her everything in exchange for the one thing that mattered, her stone. To accept was to finally agree with all of them, to agree that she was a failure at her passion but reliable as a cog, to agree that her stone was, in fact, just Lixo. All she had to do was say yes, and the pain of the silent forum, the anxiety of the storage unit, the fear of the resistance, it would all go away. She would be safe. She would be normal. She would be reliable. And she would be, finally and forever, dead. She was trapped. The word was no longer a metaphor, it was a precise technical description of her state. She was caught in the dead space between two opposing gravitational pulls. On one side there was the promotion, It was a tangible, massive object. It was security, stability, and the end of all financial anxiety. It was the family script, realized, the safe harbor, the ultimate validation of her parents' worldview. It was, most powerfully, the source of Mark's first real, uncomplicated joy in years. The gravity of this choice was immense. It was the pull of the entire normal world, begging her to be sensible, to be reliable. On the other side was the silence. It was the cold, indifferent void of the community forum. It was the failed desk, the rejected stone that, it turned out, the world had also rejected. This was the failure of her new, fragile philosophy. It was the proof that her passion was, just as Mark had always implied, a foolish and useless hobby. These two forces were tearing her apart. The promotion offered an escape from the humiliation of her failed purpose. But her purpose was supposed to be the escape from the emptiness of the promotion. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. She was paralyzed, unable to choose, and the deadline to accept the supervisor position was looming. She needed an answer. She could not find it in her own mind, which was a battlefield of conflicting, screaming voices. She could not find it in Mark, who had become the chief advocate for the safe prison. There was only one person whose reality seemed to operate on a different axis, one person who had given her the map in the first place. She needed Elpidio. She was not just seeking advice. She was seeking a guru, a master, a judge. She was desperate for him to simply tell her what to do. She needed him to be her muleta, her emotional crutch, to take the terrifying weight of this choice off her shoulders. She went to the warehouse on his shift, her heart pounding with a frantic, juvenile desperation. This was not the calm, curious seeker from before. This was a panicked child, lost in the woods, running toward the only light she knew. She looked for him in the break room. Empty. She walked the long, familiar corridors, the squeak of her shoes echoing in the night shift quiet. He was not there. A new, cold and specific terror began to creep in, a fear she had not even considered. What if he was not just elsewhere? What if he was gone? She finally found him, not in his usual domain, but in the small, cramped janitorial supply closet near the main loading bay. The room smelled of industrial bleach and old mops, and he was there, but he was not cleaning, he was packing. There was a single worn brown cardboard box on his cart. He was placing his thermos into it, his worn work gloves. A small framed picture of a family she had never seen. The sight was so mundane, so simple, and yet so utterly catastrophic. It was the image of an ending. She burst in, the words tumbling out of her, breathless. She asked him what he was doing. He looked up, his eyes showing no surprise, only that same steady, devastating calm. He told her simply that he was retiring. His grandchildren were in another state. It was time. The word retiring hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You cannot. Not now." And the dam broke. She spilled everything. The promotion, the money, the safety, Mark's joy, and then the desk, the silence, the forum, the failure, the indifference, the paralyzing, impossible choice. She laid it all at his feet, the wreckage of her life, and she begged him, "You have to tell me what to do. Which one is it? The stone or the safety? Which one do I choose?" She was crying now, the hot, humiliating tears of the utterly lost. She was begging him for the answer. He finished packing the box. He taped it shut. The sound of the tape, a loud, final sealing noise in the small room. He turned to her. He did not offer pity. He did not offer comfort. He just looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than just calm. It was a kind of profound, steady respect. He told her that he could not give her that answer. He said he was just a janitor. He just cleaned the floors. Then he picked up the box. He said, "The stone is yours, Eliza. It was never mine. I just showed you where it was." He walked toward the door. He paused just for a second. He looked at her over his shoulder. "You already know what to do." And then he was gone. She was left alone in the closet, the smell of bleach stinging her eyes. The crutch was gone. The guru had left. The emotional and philosophical support that had been the scaffolding for her entire new identity had just been ripped away at the single most critical moment. This is the moment in the journey, the ventre da baleia, the belly of the whale. This is the point where the guide must leave. The mentor's job is not to provide the answers, it is to provide the questions, and then to disappear, forcing the student to internalize the lesson and become their own master. Elpidio's final, greatest gift to her was his departure. But for Eliza, it did not feel like a gift. It felt like the ultimate cosmic abandonment. It was the cry of the 22nd Psalm, the desolate, echoing question, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The one person who saw her, who understood her stone, had just walked away, leaving her to face the impossible choice, completely and utterly alone. The mentor was gone. She was on her own, and she had to decide. Would she trust the lesson, even though the teacher was gone? Or would she retreat to the safety of the prison, now that the one person who believed in her freedom had disappeared? She drove home. The car was a silent, moving box. The reality of Elpidio's departure was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. He was gone. The crutch was gone. The single external point of reference that had validated her new path, the only person in the world who understood the map, had just walked out of her life. He had not just retired, he had abdicated. He had left her on the throne of her own life, with a crown of thorns and a kingdom in ashes. The deadline for the promotion was ticking. The forum was silent. The stone was a dead weight in her hand. She arrived at the apartment. It was not a refuge, it was just the next location, the only other place she was allowed to be. She opened the door. The apartment was dark. The silence inside was a different texture from the silence of the warehouse. It was not the silence of empty space. It was the silence of a vacuum, an active, sucking void. This silence was the sound of her future, the sound of the forum, the sound of her own hollowed-out soul. It was a complete hermetic seal of hopelessness. She was back in the prison, but this time the one person with the key was gone. She walked into the living room, and there he was. Mark. He was not a person. He was a shape, a silhouette, defined only by the cold, blue, rectangular light of the screen in his hands. He was the digital ghost. He was tapping, scrolling, his entire consciousness poured into a world that was not this one, a world where she did not exist. He did not look up. He did not register her presence. He might have grunted, a small automatic sound, but it was the acknowledgement one gives to a flickering light, not a person. She could have been a piece of furniture. She could have been on fire. It would not have mattered. This was the bottom. This was the convergence. The promotion, the safe path, was a lie, a comfortable death sentence. The new path, her stone, her desk, was a proven, humiliating failure, met with the total, crushing indifference of the world. And the guide, the mentor, the one person who had given her the map out of this hell, had vanished at the exact moment she needed him most. All three doors, the past, Mark, the future, the desk, and the guide, Elpidio, had closed and locked at the precise same instant. She was left in the dark hallway of her life, with no exits. This is the state the mystics called the dark night of the soul. We have romanticized this term, imagining it to be a kind of poetic, noble sadness. But the true noite oscura, as the Spanish mystic San Juan de Cruz described it, is not a feeling of darkness. It is the absence of all feeling. It is the moment the soul is convinced, not that it is in trouble, but that it is the trouble. It is the purification by fire, where every attachment, every crutch, every external source of validation is methodically and painfully burned away. Elpidio's departure was the final act of this purification. Eliza's hope, she now realized, had not truly been in her stone, it had been in him. Her faith was not in the lesson, it was in the teacher. And so, the teacher had to be removed. The safety net of the promotion had to be revealed as a trap. The quick validation of the desk had to be denied. Every external support had to fail, forcing her to find out if there was anything at all, left inside. This is the terrible, clarifying, and non-negotiable logic of the bottom. It is a place of awful, perfect clarity. There is one song, one prayer. in the entire ancient canon of the Psalms that is brave enough to live in this space. It is the 88th Psalm. It is unique. It is terrifying. It is the only psalm that does not end with hope. It does not resolve. It does not offer a silver lining. It is the only song that ends in total unmitigated darkness. Its final devastating line is a confession of this exact state. Darkness is my companion. This was not a metaphor for Eliza. It was a literal description of her reality. She was sitting in the physical dark, and her only companion, the ghost on the sofa, was also a form of darkness. She walked past the blue-lit silhouette, a ghost passing a ghost. She went to the kitchen and sat in the chair in the pitch black. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. Tears would be a relief, a feeling, a sign of life. This was the void. The silence in her mind was absolute. The internal critic was gone. The resentment was gone. The hope was gone. Everything was gone. There was only the low electric hum of the refrigerator. The deadline for the promotion was tomorrow. The silent forum post was a digital tombstone. She was completely, utterly, and finally alone. This is the moment the ego dies. It is the Ponto Zero, the absolute zero of the soul, where all motion, all striving, all fear, and all hope cease. The world has proven her worst fears correct. She is a failure, she is alone, and there is no help. The question is no longer, what will she do? The question is she even still alive? Is this the end? Is this where her story concludes, not with a bang, but with a quiet, invisible, and reliable fade to black? Is she, after all this, just another piece of junk, another SKU to be filed away in the dark? She sat in the absolute, total darkness of the kitchen. The silence was no longer a void. It was a presence. It was the only presence. The low, electric hum of the refrigerator was the baseline of the universe, the only sound left. In the other room, the blue light of the phone screen was the only star, a cold, distant galaxy where the ghost of her companion resided. She was at absolute zero. The dark night of the soul was not a storm. It was this: a perfect, cold, and motionless calm, a complete cessation of all things. The fight was over. She had lost. Her stone was just a rock. The promotion was just a job. She was just nothing. Then a violation. A harsh buzzing sound ripped through the silence. Her phone on the kitchen table began to vibrate. It skittered across the wood, a frantic, demanding, violent intrusion. The screen lit up the darkness, casting a strobing, pale light on her face. She did not need to see the name. It was the world. It was the deadline. It was the supervisor calling for her answer about the promotion. It was the family script demanding its final signature. It was the safe prison, its doors wide open, politely insisting that she enter. It was the final temptation. The voices in her head, the ones that had been silent, woke up. They were no longer a chorus. They were a panicked mob screaming at her from all sides. Answer it. Take the job. It is your only chance. You failed. You know you failed. The desk was a joke. The silence proved it. Take the safety. Take the money. Be reliable. Be normal. Save yourself. The internal critic, the voice of her perfectionism, the voice of her resentment, they were all in terrified agreement for the first time. They were begging her to save them, to save this identity, this self that was built on the solid, known foundation of her failure. She just looked at the phone. It vibrated, a relentless, angry insect in the dark. She did not move. It was not a choice. It was not an act of defiance. It was a collapse. It was a state of exhaustion so profound that it had become a kind of inverted strength. She was too tired to obey the fear. She was too tired to listen to the voices. She was too broken to even reach for the safety of the prison. The fight had taken everything. There was nothing left to fight with. She had no hope left to defend. She had no energy left to muster. She just stopped. She let it ring. This is the moment we mistake for the end. We see this total, profound inaction as the final defeat. We believe the story is over. But the great masters of the Tao, the philosophers of the natural way like Lao Tzu, understood that this is not defeat. This is Wu Wei. It is the most powerful and most difficult of all human actions. It is the action of non-action. It is the moment you finally, truly, stop fighting the current. It is not giving up on life. It is giving up the frantic, exhausting, and useless fight against the reality of your life. It is the moment you stop feeding the antagonists. For 5 years, Eliza had been in a state of constant, desperate internal action. She had been actively resenting. She had been actively fearing. She had been actively paralyzing herself. Even her new path, her stone, had become a frantic striving for validation, a fight for a result. It was all effort, it was all resistance. This, her collapse in the kitchen, was the first moment of true surrender. She was not surrendering to the promotion. She was not surrendering to her failure. She was surrendering the fight itself. She was letting go of the rope. She was letting the war end. There is an ancient, profound, and simple instruction for this exact moment. It is the core of the 46th Psalm. It is the universe's command to the frantic, warring soul. Be still and know. It is not a suggestion to be passive. It is a command to stop the internal violence, stop the noise, stop the striving, stop the obsessive scrubbing of the wrong floor, stop the negotiations with the past, stop the terror of the future. Just be still. In that absolute, terrifying, and total stillness, the knowing finally has room to arise. The ego, the false self that is built on fear and striving, must first starve in the silence. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went dark. The silence that rushed back in was no longer a void. It was an emptiness. It was a clean slate. Eliza was still in the chair. She had accepted the failure of her desk. She had refused the safety of the promotion. Not by choice, but by collapse. She had lost her guide. She had lost her partner. She had lost herself. She was at Ponto Zero. She was a field burned to the ground, covered in ash. Is this the end of the story? Or is this the only way a new, real, and authentic life can possibly begin? Is this the death of the failure, or just the necessary silent winter before the spring? She sat in the chair, a statue of ash in the dark. The phone, which had been the voice of her temptation, the call from the supervisor, was silent. She was in the Ponto Zero, the absolute stillness of surrender. The be still part of the ancient command was complete. She had stopped fighting. She had let go of the rope. The world, with all its demands and its disappointments, had finally, mercifully faded to a dull, distant hum. She was not happy. She was not sad. She was just empty. A vessel scoured clean by despair, waiting. She was not expecting anything. Hope was a muscle she no longer possessed. Then a new violation. Buzz. A different sound. Not the insistent, angry rattle of a phone call. A single, short electronic notification. The screen lit up again, a pale blue rectangle in the black. Her first thought was exhaustion. A text. The supervisor, no doubt, following up on his call. Or her mother with her radar for anxiety. Or Mark, texting her from the other room, asking where the remote was. It was just more noise, more of the world, refusing to let her rest in her grave. She stared at the screen, at the truncated line of text, too tired to even feel annoyed. But the text was not from her boss. It was not from her family. It was not from Mark. The preview showed a username she did not recognize. It was a notification from the community forum. Her heart, which she had assumed was dormant, gave a single, painful, metallic lurch. She tapped the screen, her fingers moving with a cold, robotic detachment. She was not curious. She was just an automaton, completing a task. The message opened. She began to read. The words, at first, were just shapes. I got the desk. I have to tell you. This is amazing. She read the words again and again. They were not computing. They were data from a universe she no longer inhabited. The message continued. It's like you knew exactly what I needed. I have been trying to work off my dining table for a year, and this just solved everything. The hidden compartments for the power strips, the way it fits in the corner. How did you know? Seriously, how did you know? She held the phone, the glowing words the only light in the room, and she felt a sound in her mind. It was a click, a loud, sharp, mechanical sound like a massive, ancient iron lock, rusted shut for 5 years, suddenly, violently turning. Elpidio's voice. The stone that the builders rejected. His other voice. What did you learn from that stone? And the glowing screen in her hand, asking the exact same question. How did you know? The answer exploded in her mind, a supernova of light, obliterating the darkness. I knew because I failed. I knew what you needed because I am you. I knew you needed compact design because my failure taught me about wasted inventory and small spaces. I knew you needed hidden power compartments because my failure taught me that pretty is useless, but functional is everything. I knew you needed it to be affordable because my failure burned my bank account to the ground. This was it. This was the moment. The Chekhov's gun from the warehouse floor, Elpidio picking up the broken wood, the lesson of the rejected stone, and the final radical instruction to serve. It all synthesized in this one single glowing message. This is the truth the great philosophers of meaning, like Viktor Frankl, discovered in the heart of unimaginable suffering. He taught that our pain, our suffering, is meaningless until we find a meaning for it. The incident, the fire, the debt, the 5 years of shame, it was all just a raw, festering wound. Until this second. In this moment, in the act of serving this one person, that entire ugly, rejected past was redeemed. It was not a failure. It was her education. It was not a stain. It was research. This was the ikigai. It was not a soft, abstract, spiritual feeling. It was a practical, functional, technical map. Her passion, woodworking, was the vehicle. Her rejected stone, her brutal, practical 5-year education in logistics, marketing, and cash flow failure, was the engine. And what the world needs, this one single, struggling freelancer, was the destination. She had been trying to drive the vehicle with no engine. She had been staring at the engine, believing it was just a pile of scrap metal. Elpidio had not given her an answer. He had given her the assembly instructions. The ancient poets in the 119th Psalm pleaded, "Open my eyes that I may see the wonder." Her eyes were open. The wonder was this. Her greatest wound was her greatest weapon. Her shame was her superpower. The very thing that made her unhireable as a dreamer was the exact thing that made her invaluable as a builder. The entire massive gravitational focus of her life, which had been a self-absorbed, suffocating spiral inward, her pain, her fear, her resentment, had just been violently and permanently reoriented outward. The question was no longer, how do I escape? It was, who else needs this? The paralysis was gone, not because she had defeated it, but because she had just given it a new job. The phone was a singularity, a single point of light and heat in the absolute zero of the kitchen. Eliza's body was a hollowed-out shell, a container of ash, but her eyes were fixed on the message. How did you know? The words were not a compliment. They were a key. They were the click of the lock. The epiphany was still echoing, a seismic event that was, in real time, rebuilding the shattered architecture of her mind. The energy that flooded her was not joy. It was not relief. It was clarity. It was the cold, clean, undeniable light of a mathematical proof. Her hands, which had been numb, began to shake. But it was not the tremor of fear. It was the vibration of an engine that had just, for the first time, ignited. Her thumb, moving with its own agency, its own profound intelligence, moved over the screen. She began to type. Her reply was short. It was not a sales pitch. It was not a business proposal. It was a promise. She wrote, "Thank you. I am glad it helped. Yes, I can make the matching bookshelf." Her thumb hovered over the send button for a single heart-stopping second. This was the true leap. This was the real burning of the ships. It was not the purchase of the wood. It was the commitment to the service. She hit send. The message was gone. The contract was made. She did not feel terror. She did not feel excitement. She felt the simple, profound weight of purpose. She stood up, her movement no longer the defeated shuffle of a ghost. She walked to the wall and flipped the light switch. The kitchen, her arena of despair, was instantly flooded with harsh, clinical light. She did not flinch. She needed to see. She went to the drawer, the same drawer where she had hidden her sketchbook from Mark, and pulled it out. She opened it not to the old hesitant drawings, but to a clean, fresh page. She sat at the table. This was the planning. But the quality of the thought was alien to her. The voice in her head was no longer the screaming, paralyzed internal critic. It was not the ruminating, wounded voice of resentment. It was a new voice. It was calm. It was technical. It was the voice of a solver. She was not thinking, "What if I fail?" She was not thinking, "What will Mark say?" She was thinking, "A bookshelf. Okay, it needs to match the desk. He's a freelancer, so space is the problem. It needs to be vertical. How tall? What about his printer? He must have a printer. It needs a shelf that is deep enough and reinforced. What about paper? A slot, a dedicated slot for a ream of paper." This is the great secret pivot. This is the mechanism that breaks the paralysis. For 5 years, her perfectionism had been an invincible tyrant, a disease of the self. It was a loop of I. What will I look like? How will I be judged? What if I am not good enough? But this new work, this new plan was not about I. It was about he. What does he need? How can I solve his problem? Her new mission to serve did not defeat her internal critic. It simply bypassed it. It starved it of the one thing it needed to survive, her self-obsession. The problem of service was so much more compelling, so much more interesting, than the boring, repetitive problem of self. This is the wisdom that the great Taoist philosophers tried to teach. The mind that is paralyzed by perfectionism is trying to build the entire 1,000-mile road in its head, all at once. It sees the overwhelming, impossible distance, and so it concludes that it is better not to even take the first step. It is a paralysis of scale. But the mind that has surrendered, the mind that is aligned with the natural way, does not see the 1,000 miles. It only sees the single, simple, logical step in front of it. It focuses on the micro-valor. Eliza was not planning Eliza's Dreams version 2.0. She was not planning an empire. She was just planning one bookshelf. She sketched, her lines no longer timid but decisive, confident. She was pulling data from all her worlds. From the warehouse, her prison, she pulled the cold, hard logic of ergonomics, spatial efficiency, and load-bearing weight. From her rejected stone, her failure, she pulled the wisdom of cash flow. She would price this for materials and a small sustainable profit, not a fantasy, and marketing. She now had a market of one, which was infinitely better than a market of 0. From her passion, her hands, she pulled the skill. This was not a hobby or an art project. It was an act of applied, integrated intelligence. This right here is the profound prayer of the 90th Psalm. It is the simple, powerful plea of the craftsman. Establish the work of our hands. Let it have meaning. Let it have weight. Let it be. Her work at the warehouse was never established. It was ephemeral, meaningless motion. Boxes moved from one dark shelf to another. It was work that left no mark on the world, only on her soul. But this sketch, this plan for one single man, this solution born from her specific, unique pain, this was established work. It was real. It had a purpose. And in the clean, bright light of the kitchen, Eliza, the solver, the builder, began to draw the blueprints of her own liberation. The plans were on the floor of the storage unit, a map drawn on a piece of cardboard. The raw lumber, smelling of pine and potential, was stacked against the wall. This was the moment. This was the second attempt. But the air was different. The first time she had built the desk, it was an act of desperate, terrified hope. This time it was an act of contract. A person was waiting. A need had been identified. This was not art. This was not a hobby. This was a job. She picked up the circular saw, its cold metal handle a familiar heavy weight, and as her finger found the trigger, the voice returned, exactly on cue. It was the old familiar paralyzing voice of her critic. It did not just whisper. It presented a calm, rational, and devastating legal argument. This is a mistake. It told her the wood was too expensive. It told her the plans were flawed. It reminded her, with surgical precision, that the only reason she got this job was because she had essentially given away the first one. It was a fluke, a statistical error, a moment of pity from a stranger. The voice told her that this time, with money on the line, she would be exposed. You are not a professional. You are a warehouse worker. You are a fraud. The Eliza of 3 weeks ago would have put the saw down. She would have been paralyzed by that voice, by its perfect, irrefutable logic. But this was a new Eliza. She was no longer a victim, she was a solver. She was no longer a dreamer, she was a builder. She heard the voice, she acknowledged it. She felt the cold dread, the familiar tremor in her hands. And then she made a conscious, profound, and life-altering decision. She decided to let the voice be there. It could come along for the ride. It could sit in the passenger seat and scream all it wanted. But it was not allowed to drive. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the saw was a violent, liberating scream. It ripped through the silence, through the paralysis, through the 5 years of caked-on, calcified fear. She made the first cut. The blade bit into the wood, sending a spray of fine, clean dust into the yellow light. The cut was not perfect. It was a fraction of a degree off. Her internal critic shrieked in triumph. "See? You failed! It is ruined!" But a new voice, the calm, quiet, technical voice of the solver, responded without emotion. "It is fine, we will sand it, it just has to be functional. It has to hold his printer." This was the miracle. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of action despite the fear. This was the antidote. For her entire life, her paralysis had been a perfect, circular, theoretical argument. But action, even imperfect action, is a brute force reality. It is a fact. It cannot be argued with. She was no longer trapped in the hypothetical terror of what if. She was fully, physically, and completely immersed in the tangible reality of what is. She was, at last, applying the true hidden meaning of Elpidio's first lesson. She was finally cleaning the floor of today. This is the great, powerful secret of the masters of the present moment, the philosophers who taught that the only solution to the anxiety of the mind is the labor of the hands. She was not thinking about the promotion. She was not thinking about Mark. She was not thinking about her business or her future. Her entire vast and terrifying universe, a universe of past regrets and future catastrophes, had shrunk to the size of a single pencil line on a 2x4. Her focus was absolute. It was not on the why, it was on the how. How to make this joint fit, how to countersink this screw. The work was not easy. It was not a magical, flowing, cinematic montage. It was hard. It was frustrating. She made mistakes. She measured wrong and had to recut a piece, the waste wood a sharp pang in her chest. She hit her thumb with the hammer, the jolt of pain a shocking physical fact. It was messy, it was flawed. It was, by every definition, imperfect action. But it was action. It was movement. It was the physical, undeniable proof that the paralysis was a choice, not a sentence. She was sweating, she was covered in sawdust, and she had not felt this alive, this real, in her entire life. This is the profound, dignified, and ancient promise of the 128th Psalm. It is the simple declaration that you will eat the labor of your hands. We mistake this for a purely economic statement, a promise of food. But it is a psychological promise. It is the promise that if you engage in the work, if you place your hands on the raw material of your life, you will be nourished by it. The act of creation itself is the reward. Eliza was finally consuming her own purpose, not just being consumed by her own pain. She was building a bookshelf, and in the process she was building a self. After hours it was done. It stood in the center of the small, dusty room. It was tall, strong, and functional. Her internal critic was still there, diligently listing its flaws. A small gap in the joinery here, a slight unevenness in the stain there. But she looked at it, and for the first time she did not see the flaws. She saw the solution. It was not a masterpiece of art. It was a masterpiece of service. It would hold his printer. It would store his paper. It would solve his problem. It was the work of her hands, and it was good. The delivery was the hardest part. Carrying the finished bookshelf from the storage unit to her car felt like a walk of shame, an exposure. Her internal critic, which had been momentarily quieted by the labor, was now back, and it was screaming. It told her she was a fool, an imposter. She was a warehouse worker in a stolen uniform, pretending to be a carpenter. She drove to the freelancer's apartment, a small walk-up building in a neighborhood just like hers. Every step she took up the stairs, the heavy, solid wood biting into her hands, was an argument for turning back. The critic was whispering, "He is going to hate it. He will see the flaws. He will ask for his money back." She knocked. The door opened. The freelancer, a young man who looked as tired as she felt, looked at the bookshelf, and his eyes went wide. The reaction was so immediate, so unguarded, that it stopped her critic mid-sentence. He did not inspect it for flaws. He did not look at the joinery. He just said, "Wow." He stepped back, and she and a friend of his maneuvered it into the tiny, cramped living room that was also his office. He placed it in the corner, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been grown there. He immediately put his printer on the designated shelf. It held, solid. He slotted a ream of paper into the space she had built for it. He stood back, not just looking at the shelf, but at his newly transformed space. He was not just happy, he was relieved. He looked at Eliza, and his gaze was not that of a customer. It was that of a patient who had just been given the right medicine. He told her, This just changed my whole life." He paid her. The cash exchanged quickly, almost as an afterthought, and Eliza realized with a shock that the money was the least important part of the transaction. It was not the currency. The currency was his relief. The payment was the proof that she had been useful. Then the moment. The freelancer, still marveling at the shelf, turned to her. He said, "My colleague, the one who works remotely with me, she saw the desk you made. And now she just saw this. She wants to know, can you make 2 more for her?" He was not asking for a discount. He was not negotiating. He was a man who had found a spring in the desert, and he was asking on behalf of someone else for more water. This was the sound. This was the sound of demand. This was the sound that, for the first time in 5 agonizing years, completely and utterly silenced the voice of her internal critic. There is an ancient agricultural wisdom, a promise found in the 126th Psalm, that speaks of those who sow in tears. It is a hard, brutal, and thankless act, planting seeds in the wet, broken ground of your own grief. Eliza had been doing that for 5 years, every day in the warehouse. Her rejected stone, her failure, was the tear-soaked field. She had been planting her pain, her shame, her data, her hard-won lessons, with no expectation of a harvest. And now, this, the freelancer's request. This was the harvest. This was the reaping with songs of joy. It was not a miracle, it was a consequence. The harvest was not the wood, it was the solution the wood represented. This is the beautiful, simple, and perfect mechanism of the world that we so often forget. The great early philosophers of value, like Adam Smith, had a name for it. It is the invisible hand. It is not a magical spiritual force. It is the natural, logical, and inevitable outcome of aligned purpose. Eliza, by focusing away from herself, her fear, her paralysis, and focusing onto him, his need, his problem, had set this in motion. She served her own purpose, her ikigai, in the most authentic way she could. And in doing so, she had, without even trying, served his purpose. And the market, even a tiny nascent market of 2 people in a cramped apartment, had responded. This was the validation. It was not a like. It was not feedback. It was a new order. It was a signal from the world that said, what you are doing, the thing that is born from your specific pain and your specific passion, has value. She was no longer trying to be something. She was no longer a failure or a warehouse worker or a hobbyist. In that moment, in that apartment, holding a new order in her hand, she was a solution. The question that had haunted her in the storage unit, how do you turn this into a path, had just been answered. You do not turn it. You just walk it. You just answer the next request. You just solve the next problem. You just build the next shelf. The path is not a thing you find. It is the thing you create by the act of walking. Her critic was silent, not because it was dead, but because it was irrelevant. It had no argument that could stand against the simple, undeniable economic fact of a new customer. She had proven her value, and now she just had to get back to work. The machine was in motion. The reliable component, Eliza, had been offered an upgrade, and the system, which abhors a vacuum, required an answer. Her supervisor found her at her station, his face set in the familiar, neutral expression of administrative duty. He told her, Eliza, that he needed her decision on the supervisor role by the end of the day. The paperwork had to be filed. The slot had to be filled. He was not being unkind. He was not pressuring her. He was simply enforcing the quiet, relentless logic of the machine she had belonged to for 5 years. The promotion, which had been a vague future temptation, just became an immediate present-tense ultimatum. She nodded, her voice a hollow echo, and promised an answer. The weight of the choice settled on her, a physical pressure. This was it. The golden cage, the prison confortable, was holding its door wide open, and the warden was tapping his watch. This was the materialization of her family script, the ultimate validating goal of her parents' anxious prayers. It was the solution to Mark's fear. It was safety, a security, and a future, all wrapped in a neat, salaried package. It was, by every measure of the world she knew, the only logical answer. She escaped to the break room, needing air, needing a square foot of neutral ground to think. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the button to call her boss and just accept, to surrender, to end the fight, to let the safe world win. It would be so easy, a relief, but just as she was about to do it, the phone vibrated in her hand. A notification, not the supervisor, a message from the community forum, a new username, a stranger. The message read, "Hi, I'm a friend of Freelancer's name. I saw the work you did on his office. It's exactly what I need. Can I place an order for a desk?" Her heart seized. She scrolled down, her breath catching in her throat. Another message from another stranger, sent only an hour before. "I heard you build custom storage for small apartments. Can you help me?" This was the crossroads. It was not a hypothetical, philosophical choice anymore. It was a concrete, binary decision, laid bare in the buzzing digital light of her phone. On one side, a guaranteed salary, benefits, security, and the loud, unanimous approval of her entire world. The known, the safe, the prison. On the other side, 2 more orders, 2 more leaps into the unknown, built on nothing but a fragile, newfound trust in her own rejected stone. We are all in our lives climbers on a great pyramid of needs. The philosophers of human potential, like Abraham Maslow, mapped this journey for us. At the bottom, the wide, solid, foundational layers, is the non-negotiable primal need for security. This is the paycheck, the roof, the health insurance, the absence of physical threat. It is the world of the warehouse, the logic of the promotion. It is a vital, necessary stage of life, and there is no shame in living there. But it is not the point of life, it is just the base camp. The point, the summit, the peak, that is something else. It is self-actualization. Eliza was standing with 1 foot on each level, and the pyramid was splitting in 2. The promotion was the world offering her a permanent, comfortable, well-furnished apartment on the security level. It was an invitation to stop climbing. "It is safe here," it whispered. "The rent is paid. Why risk the fall? Why bother with the thin air up there?" But the messages on her phone, the orders from strangers, that was the voice from the summit. It was the call of her ikigai, her self-actualization, beckoning her upward, into the thin, dangerous, and exhilarating air of her own unique potential. The tragedy and the choice is that you cannot live on both levels at once. She went home that evening, the ultimatum from her boss and the new orders from the strangers, waging a silent, brutal war in her mind. She had to tell Mark. She laid out the choice, her voice trembling, showing him the promotion's solid, undeniable offer and the phone's fragile, digital promises. Mark's reaction was immediate and visceral. It was not joy as it had been before. It was fear, a deep, cold, panicked fear that she could even hesitate. He could not believe this was even a discussion. He begged her. "Take the promotion, Eliza, please. This is our life. This is security. That," he gestured to the phone, "that is a hobby. It's a risk. It's the incident all over again." His panic, his desperation to chain her to the security level with him, was the final clarifying piece of data. She looked at him, at this man she had shared a failure with, this anchor who was so terrified of the open ocean. She saw his fear, and for the first time she recognized that it was his, not hers. This was the moment of divergence. The ancient poets in the 16th Psalm wrote of this. It is not a plea, it is a quiet, confident declaration. You will show me the path of life. She finally saw the choice for exactly what it was. The promotion was the path of survival. The orders were the path of life. She was standing at the ultimate fork in the road. To her left, the wide, paved, well-lit and gently descending road of security, where her family and her companion were cheering her on. To her right, a narrow, unpaved, unlit and brutally steep footpath that led up into the clouds, marked only by two new, uncertain orders. The world, her past and her partner were all screaming, "Choose safety! Choose survival!" But the quiet, steady voice of her stone, it was whispering one simple word: climb. It was the next morning. The deadline was no longer a looming shadow. It was a physical point in time. The warehouse was, as always, a symphony of monotonous, industrial noise. Eliza walked through it, but for the first time she did not feel like a part of it. She was not a cog in the machine. She was an observer, a visitor from another world, who just happened to be wearing the uniform. The fluorescent hum, the shriek of the tape, the rumble of the forklifts, it all seemed very far away. She was walking to the supervisor's office and she felt no fear. She felt no anxiety. She felt nothing but a profound, cold and absolute calm. She stood in the doorway of the office. Her supervisor looked up, his face already set in the neutral mask of a man expecting a simple yes. He gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. She looked at this man, at his clean desk, at his spreadsheets, at the prison confortable he was offering her, and she saw it clearly with no emotion. It was not a golden cage. It was just an office. It was a choice, and it was, she realized, simply the wrong choice for her. The Eliza of 6 months ago, the woman of the incident, would have seen this as a binary, emotional decision. She would have had two options: impulsive, fiery rebellion, quit in a blaze of glory, or fearful, resentful surrender, take the job and die inside. Both were extremes, both were reactions. But the Eliza standing in this doorway was no longer a reactor. She was a builder, she was a solver. And in the past few weeks, she had been applying her greatest rejected stone, her brutal education in failure, to her entire life. And what had that stone taught her? It was not the job that was the enemy. The true enemy, the one that had actually destroyed her, was debt. It was the lack of cash flow. It was the folly of leaping without a rope. To quit this job, in a fit of artistic integrity, would be to repeat the exact same impulsive, fatal mistake she made 5 years ago. It would be, in its own way, just as unreliable as her paralysis. To accept the promotion would be a different kind of death. She needed a third path. So she built one. She spoke, her voice quiet, calm, and astonishingly professional. She told her supervisor respectfully that she would not be accepting the promotion. He frowned, his script interrupted. He started to speak, to remind her of the opportunity, but she continued, her tone deferential but firm. She told him, in the language of logistics he would understand, that she was launching a small, parallel market fabrication business. She explained that it was a low-volume, high-customization venture, the new orders her ikigai, but that it was beginning to require more of her focus. He opened his mouth to tell her that this was a bad idea, that she was throwing away her security. And then she made her move. This was the media di orada, the golden mean. She told him that because of her respect for the company and her need for foundational stability, she was not quitting. Instead, she was proposing a transition. She offered to move to a half-time schedule. She saw his immediate negative reaction and countered it, using his own word. She said, "I am your most reliable employee. I will not just leave. I will, on my own time, train my replacement for the other half of my duties, ensuring a zero-disruption transition." She framed it not as a loss for him, but as a solution for both of them. He was stunned. This was not in any managerial playbook. It was not rebellion, it was not compliance, it was a calm, logical, and bizarrely professional negotiation. He looked at the logic, at the woman who had never caused him a single problem, and he saw the truth of her offer. A reliable, trained half-time employee was infinitely better than a vacant supervisor slot and a resentful full-time cog. He was, to his own surprise, cornered by her sheer competence. He sighed, rubbed his face, and with a sense of profound confusion he agreed. She walked out of the office. There was no orchestra swell, there were no tears of joy, there was no dramatic, triumphant exit. She just walked back onto the warehouse floor, and the feeling that washed over her was so profound, so pure, it was almost nothing. It was the complete absence of conflict. This is the peace that the ancient poets, in the 4th Psalm, described. It is the peace of the soul that has finally acted in perfect, unadulterated alignment with its own truth. It is the ability to lie down and sleep in the middle of the day, in the middle of the chaos, because you are, at last, at peace with yourself. We are taught that life is a battle of extremes, a grand drama. We are told that we must be the courageous rebel or the cowardly sellout. But the great philosophers, like Aristotle, taught a different, quieter, and more profound truth. They taught that virtue is rarely, if ever, found in the extremes. True wisdom, true courage, true life is almost always found in the golden mean. It is the balanced, strategic, and virtuous middle ground between two vices. Eliza had not chosen the vice of recklessness, quitting, or the vice of cowardice, accepting. She had, with the skill of a master builder, found the media durada. She had found the virtue of prudence. She was using her family script, the security of the job, to finance her ikigai, her new business. She had, in short, synthesized her new self. That evening she went home. The peace was still with her, a cool, quiet internal shield. Mark was on the sofa, his anxiety a palpable, vibrating field in the room. He saw her walk in, and his face was a raw, open, desperate question. He asked, "You took it, right? Tell me you took it. Tell me we are safe." She stood in the entryway, no longer his anchor, no longer his cellmate. She was just herself. She looked at him, her eyes clear, and she told him the truth. "I did not take the promotion. I am moving to half-time." The sentence was a stone, dropped into the stagnant, silent water of their relationship. The peace was hers. But she knew, as she watched his face crumble, not in anger, but in sheer, unadulterated terror that the war in her home had just begun. The rhythm of her life was redrawn. It was no longer a single, monotonous grey line. It was a duet, a counterpoint. Half of her week, she still wore the uniform. She still walked the steel corridors of the warehouse. But the resentment was gone. The apathy was gone. The fluorescent lights no longer felt like an interrogation. The job was no longer her prison. It was, she realized, her angel investor. It was the stable, predictable, and somewhat stupid partner that was quietly, reliably financing her true life. This psychological pivot changed everything. The work was still dull, but it was no longer degrading. It was a means to a glorious end. This was the masterful stroke of her new integrated self. She had not just rejected her family's anxious script, she had harnessed it. She was using their obsession with security to her advantage. She still sent them the pay stubs, which calmed their panic. She was still reliable. She was, in essence, skillfully managing their fear, but she was no longer being managed by it. The salary from her half-time work was the ballast that allowed her to sail her own ship. It was the ultimate strategic application of her rejected stone. She was avoiding the fatal cash flow error that had destroyed her the first time. The other half of her week she was a different person. The cold, secret, guilty space of the storage unit was retired. With the profits from the new orders, she rented a small, proper one-car garage in a light industrial park. It was gritty, smelled of oil, and had a roll-up door that faced an alley. It was, by every measure, perfect. Her first act was not to build, but to claim. She bought a can of black paint, and in simple, strong letters, she painted on the door, "Angular Workshop." It was a declaration. It was an homage. It was the public, undeniable acceptance of Elpidio's lesson. The stone, angular is cornerstone, was no longer hidden. It was her shingle. This is the profound difference between a job and a vocation. The German philosophers had a word for it, Beruf, a calling, The warehouse was her job. It was a function, an exchange of time for money. It was the work of her hands, but not her heart. The workshop, that was her beruf. It was the work that felt like a moral, spiritual, and personal necessity. It was the work she would do even if she were not paid, but which, by a miracle of alignment, she was being paid for. When she was at the warehouse, she was drained. When she was in the workshop, she was filled. We see here the ancient wisdom, the metaphor of the healthy soul described in the very first psalm. It is not a song about piety, it is a song about physics. It describes a person who is like a tree planted by rivers of water. For 5 years, Eliza had been a tree trying to grow in concrete. She was in the wrong soil. The warehouse, the apartment, the relationship, it was all barren ground, and her leaves were withering. Her resentment and apathy were the signs of this slow death. But by choosing her purpose, by building her workshop, she had, with her own hands, uprooted herself and replanted her entire life in fertile soil. She began to prosper. The 2 orders became 4, and the 4 became a small, steady waiting list. Her market was a niche of a niche, people just like her, struggling in small spaces, who needed solutions, not just art. Her rejected stone was her entire marketing plan. She was not advertising, she was just serving. And the word was spreading. The money was not a tidal wave, it was a small, steady stream. But it was her stream. It was the consequence of the value she was creating, not the goal of the work. This was the final critical pivot. She was no longer chasing money, she was generating value, and the money was just the natural byproduct. She worked hard. It was not a magical, easy life, it was a life of sawdust, spreadsheets, and sweat. She would finish her shift at the warehouse, exhausted, and then drive to the workshop and feel the energy surge back into her. She was building not just furniture, but a new world. A world where her past failure was not her shame, but her competitive advantage. A world where her passion was not her hobby, but her function. She was at last the tree, planted by the water. She was bringing forth her fruit in her season, and her leaf, finally, was not withering. She had found her purpose, her rhythm. The duet of her life was, for the first time, in harmony. The warehouse provided the safety. The workshop provided the meaning. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a component. She was a builder. But the question that she had not yet had to answer, the one that lingered in the quiet of the night, was a simple one. She had found her purpose. But could this small, fragile workshop, ever become her life? Could it provide not just meaning, but true, lasting stability? The incident had taught her that passion was not enough. She had to prove it could be sustainable. 1 year later, the name on the door is no longer just a hopeful coat of paint, it is an identity. The angular workshop is not a secret, and it is not a hobby. It is a breathing, functioning, and, most importantly, sustainable reality. The garage, once a gritty, empty box, now lives. The air is thick with the clean, sharp scent of pine resin and the sweet chemical tang of varnish. The sound is not the oppressive, fluorescent hum of the warehouse. It is the focused, purposeful roar of a router, the rhythmic rasp of a handplane, the satisfying thunk of a mallet striking a chisel. This is the sound of solutions being built. Eliza is not the person who walked out of the supervisor's office. She is not the ghost who sat in the dark kitchen. She is a woman in motion, her body covered in a fine, pale sawdust that, to her, feels like a benediction. We watch her work, and we are not watching a job. We are watching a state of being. She is working on a new design, a complex wall-mounted unit for another small apartment dweller. Her focus is so total, so absolute, that the world outside the yellow circle of her work light ceases to exist. She is not fighting the wood. She is not forcing a result. She is in a dialogue with the material. This is the state that the philosophers of human potential spent a lifetime trying to name. It is the flow. It is that sacred, elusive space where skill and challenge meet, where the work is difficult enough to demand all of your attention, but not so difficult that it causes panic. In this state, the self, the small, anxious, critical I that has plagued Eliza for her entire life, simply dissolves. There is no internal critic. There is no voice of paralysis. There is no time. There is only the work. The work is not happening because of her. It is happening through her. This is the ultimate sustainable reward of her journey. The warehouse was a place that drained energy, that demanded her life in exchange for a paycheck. This workshop generates it. She finishes a piece more energized than when she began. This is the proof of her alignment. And the world, which was once so silent, is now responding in kind. Her phone, the one that used to be a source of dread, now buzzes with a different kind of notification, a new order, an inquiry from a friend of a friend. Her waiting list, which she manages in a simple dog-eared notebook, is now 3 months long. She is not a millionaire. She has not conquered the market. She has created her own small, perfect, sustainable ecosystem. She has done the one thing she never thought possible. She has looked at the numbers, not with the terror of a victim at the kitchen table, but with the calm, steady eye of a builder. And the numbers at last make sense. The small, steady stream of her workshop has grown, while the half-time paycheck from the warehouse, her angel investor, has become, she realizes, a redundancy. It is no longer her ballast. It is now officially her anchor, the last piece of the old life holding her back from the new. The decision is no longer a leap of faith. It is a simple, logical, logistical step. She walks into the warehouse for the last time. The sounds, the smells, the oppressive grey light, it is all exactly the same. But she is different. It has no power. The building is just a building. It is not her prison. It was, she realizes, her chrysalis. It was the safe place that, paradoxically, gave her the security to build her escape. She walks into the supervisor's office, no longer a component, no longer a desperate seeker, but as a peer, a professional closing out a successful contract. She hands him her resignation. It is not an emotional act. It is a piece of paperwork. She has at last finished this job. This is the quiet, profound, and ancient promise of transformation. It is the song of the 113th Psalm, the celebration of the power that raises the poor from the dust. Eliza was that dust. She was the lixo on the floor, the SKU of failure, the residue of a burned-out life. She was the forgotten, invisible component in the warehouse. But through the alchemy of her own applied purpose, she has been lifted. She was not saved by a miracle. She built her own salvation using the very dust of her past, the hard-won, gritty lessons of her failure, as the raw material. She is no longer the estoquista, the inventory. She is the constructora, the builder. She walks out of the warehouse into the bright, cold afternoon, and she does not look back. She breathes in the air, which smells for the first time not like cardboard and diesel, but like freedom. The professional half of her chaos has been resolved. She has done it. She is her own woman, her own boss, the master of her own small, purposeful world. She has built her officina angular. But as she gets in her car, the triumph is quieted by a familiar, sinking feeling. The workshop is her sanctuary, but now she has to go home. She has fixed her life, but she has not yet fixed her home, and she is about to face the one person who was and is still anchored to the failure she just transcended. She came home from the workshop, and the contrast was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical shock. She was electric with the energy of her beruf, her calling. She was alive with the smell of sawdust, her mind bright with the solution to a complex joinery problem. She opened the door to her apartment, and it was like stepping from a living world into a mausoleum. The air was cold, still, and dead, and he was there, on the sofa, a pale, blue-lit statue in the tomb, the ghost still scrolling, the anchor still holding fast to the bottom. She had been living this impossible bifurcated life for months, her world split between the vibrant, purposeful energy of the angular workshop and the stagnant, silent despair of her home. She had tried at first to share her new life. She would bring home a piece of wood, a new design, a small story of a satisfied customer. But she learned quickly. He did not see her success. He saw it as a betrayal. He saw her energy, her purpose, as an accusation. Her life was a threat to his stagnation. And so a new cold silence had formed between them, the silence of two people living in entirely different and opposing realities. Tonight, that Cold War turned hot. She walked in, and her energy, her sheer aliveness, was an offense. He looked up from the phone, his eyes not just tired, but filled with a deep, bottomless and bitter resentment. He asked her how her little hobby was. The word hobby was a deliberate poisoned dart. And then, the accusation that had been building for a year, the voice of his own terror, finally spilled out. He told her she was obsessed. He said she was lost in it, just like the incident, just like the first shop. And then the final devastating question, "You are doing it all over again. Have you learned nothing?" The Eliza of a year ago would have been destroyed. The words would have been a kill shot, a direct hit on her deepest insecurity, the SKU of failure. She would have collapsed, her fragile confidence shattered, her paralysis returning. But he was not speaking to that Eliza. He was speaking to a stranger. He was speaking to a builder. He was speaking to a woman whose self-worth was no longer a theory, no longer a hope, no longer dependent on his validation. Her worth was now a fact, forged in her workshop, proven by her waiting list and paid for in cash by a steady stream of people who needed what she built. She looked at him not with anger, but with a profound, quiet and terrible clarity. The lesson of Elpidio, the rejected stone, surfaced in her mind, and for the first time, she applied it not to herself, but to him. She finally saw. He was the one who had learned nothing. He was still in the apartment 5 years ago, standing in the ashes of the incident. He was the one still obsessively scrubbing the wrong floor. He had made their shared failure his entire identity, his excuse for inaction. He was the true ancora incompatible, and his realism was just a noble-sounding word for his profound, paralyzing fear. This is the great tragic secret of codependent relationships. They are not partnerships. They are unspoken pacts. Their pact, forged in the fire of their bankruptcy, was this: we are failures. The world is dangerous. We must stay small, and we must stay safe. And we will protect each other from all ideas. Eliza had violated the pact. She had not just dreamed, she had built. She had not just hoped, she had succeeded. Her growth, her individuation, her act of becoming whole was not a gift to their relationship. It was a betrayal of its one central, unspoken rule. He was not just losing his partner, he was losing his justification for his own paralysis. She spoke, her voice as calm and steady as the hand that now guided her router. It was not a defense, it was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a new reality. She told him that she had learned. She told him that she was building something new, not from the failure, but with the failure. She was building with the old rejected stones. And then she laid down the final, logical and non-negotiable choice. He could, she said, help her carry the stones, or he could and he must stay out of the way. It was not an ultimatum. It was a clarification. It was the moment the path diverged and he was forced to choose. He looked at her, at this stranger who was not afraid, who was not paralyzed, who was not asking for his permission, and he made his choice. He could not. To help her carry the stones would be to admit that he had been wrong for 5 years. It would be to admit that his safety was just cowardice. It would be to admit that he was the one who had failed. He could not let go of his own rejected stone, the one that told him he was the realistic one. He refused. He chose the prison. And so the relationship was over. It was not a tragedy. It was a simple logistical conclusion. She had outgrown the space. The next day she packed. It was quiet, methodical. She was not leaving a home. She was moving her headquarters from a place of stagnation to a place of life. She packed her clothes, her books, and she packed her tools. This was the final, symbolic act. She was taking her self, her new, forged, functional identity, with her. Mark just watched, a ghost on the sofa, his face a mask of terror and betrayal. The anchor finally cut loose, sinking alone to the bottom. She closed the door. She was alone. But she was not lonely. This is the freedom the ancient poets sang of. It is the cry of the 124th Psalm, the song of a soul that has finally, impossibly escaped. Our soul has escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare was not Mark, the snare was the pact. It was the codependent agreement to remain broken together. Now the snare was broken, and she was free. The sound is no longer an assault, it is a song. The high, clean whine of a router, followed by the rhythmic shh of a handplane. This is the new soundtrack. Months have passed since she walked out of the apartment, her tools in her hand. The angular workshop is no longer a beachhead of survival, it is a territory of life. The space is filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine resin and the sweet, chemical tang of varnish. Eliza is here, but she is not the Eliza we knew. She is not a component. She is an artisan. She moves with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, the same quiet, focused dignity we once saw in her mentor. The work is not frantic. It is calm. It is purposeful. It is peace. She is working on a new commission, a cabinet for a client across town. She sorts through her raw lumber, her hands reading the grain, feeling the potential. She stops. She has a piece of dark walnut, beautiful, but for one flaw. Near the edge, there is a large, complex burl, a knot where the wood grew stressed, twisted, and imperfect. The old Eliza, the apprentice of Paralysis, would have discarded this piece instantly. It was a stain. It was a failure of the material. It was a risk. It was a rejected stone. But she just looks at it, her head tilted. She sees the flaw, and she begins to redesign the cabinet, not in spite of the knot, but around it. There is an ancient Eastern art form, a philosophy born from this exact moment. It is a practice of mending. When a valuable piece of V pottery is broken, it is not thrown away. The masters of this art do not see the break as the end of the object's life. They see it as a new essential and unavoidable part of its history. They do not hide the cracks. They do not use invisible glue, pretending the failure never happened, desperately trying to restore the perfection that is now gone. Instead, they painstakingly and lovingly fill the cracks with a golden lacquer, illuminating the damage, making the fault lines the most beautiful, valuable, and celebrated part of the piece. This is not just a lesson in pottery. It is a manual for the human soul. Our world, the world of the family script and the safe promotion, teaches us the opposite. It teaches us to be ashamed of our breaks. It tells us to hide our failures, to cover our scars, to present a flawless, reliable surface to the world. We are taught that our incidents, our bankruptcies, our traumas, our stains, are our shame. We are told to scrub the floor, to hide the evidence. But this ancient golden wisdom teaches the truth, that we are not beautiful despite our brokenness. We are beautiful because of it. Our failure is the gold. Eliza, sanding the edge of that flawed walnut, has become a master of this art. She is not using gold, but she is using the same philosophy. She is placing the knot, the flaw, where it will be the central, celebrated feature of the cabinet door. She is no longer hiding her own incident. She has built an entire life that illuminates it, that turns her specific, unique pain into her specific, unique, and marketable strength. She pauses her work, the sander winding down, and she smiles, a real, quiet smile. She is remembering a squeaking cart and a man picking up a broken piece of wood. She is remembering Elpidio. She finally understands. He gave her the manual, the 118th Psalm, the stone that the builders rejected. She finally sees that this is not just one philosophy, it is the philosophy. The builders, the reliable world, rejected her. They rejected her failure. They rejected this piece of flawed wood. And in her hands, that rejection has become the cornerstone of her art, her life, and her peace. She has internalized the lesson. She no longer needs the teacher. She has become the builder. The lixo, the trash of her past, has become the raw material of her beautiful, sustainable, and authentic present. She is at last whole. We see in this final act that the journey is never about avoiding the break. It is not about finding a life without failure. It is about having the courage to re-signify the pain, to stop scrubbing the wrong floor, and to pick up the lixo and to turn it into the foundation. This is the hardest work there is, and it is the only work that matters. If this journey, this idea of transforming our deepest wounds into our greatest strengths, resonates with you, Support our mission of sharing more stories like this one. Your like and your subscription is the signal that this work matters. Eliza finishes sanding. She wipes the fine, dark dust from the wood, revealing the beautiful, complex golden whorls of the floor. She puts the tool down. She walks to the small, clean window of her workshop and looks out, not at a parking lot, but at her life. The peace she feels is not the peace of apathy, the cold, dark silence of the kitchen. It is the peace of flow. It is the deep, profound, and earned peace of a soul that is at last perfectly aligned with its purpose. She learned from Elpidio that the foundation for her new life was hidden in the lixo of her old one. The question now is for us. What is the rejected stone in your life? What is the failure, the pain, the trauma, the incident that you have been treating as trash, that you have been hiding from the world, but that might be in fact your most valuable, your most powerful, and your most beautiful cornerstone? Comment below. What did you identify with most?